The first time I saw the old factory, it wasn't in the daylight. Streetlights were flickering behind me, their weak glow barely reaching the rusted gates. The bell hung above the main entrance, cracked and tarnished, swaying slightly in the wind, though I didn't remember touching it. Its shadow stretched across the concrete like a finger pointing, but pointing at what, I wasn't sure yet. Every step I took across the gravel made that low crunch, the sound sharp enough to echo between the brick walls, louder than I expected. It felt wrong somehow. The air was thick, humid even, though no rain had fallen. I could smell the faint tang of old oil, rust, and dust, mingling with something else I couldn't identify, something metallic, almost coppery, like blood dried long ago. My hand brushed the gate as I pushed it open, and it shivered under my fingers. A soft groan of metal protested, and for a moment I thought I imagined it. Then I heard it again, a low, resonant toll like the bell was announcing me to someone or something that had been waiting. I stepped inside, the darkness folding over me like a curtain. The interior smelled heavier, denser, as if the walls themselves were breathing in and out with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I shined my flashlight down the main hallway. Machines stood like dormant beasts, their rusted arms and conveyor belts frozen mid-motion. Shadows pooled under the scaffolding, and I could have sworn I saw something move, just a twitch, barely perceptible at the corner of my eye. I shook my head. Factories are full of tricks, shadows, gaps in light. I told myself that over and over, but the feeling didn't fade. The floor creaked under me. Every step sounded too loud, echoing in the empty space, and I felt the first tug of unease. Somewhere deep in the darkness, the bell rang again, not above me, but somewhere inside the factory, a hollow, clanging echo. My stomach sank. I had read about these places. Abandoned factories keep secrets. They hold the residue of work, of life that ended and wasn't fully finished. Maybe it was just the wind, I reasoned. But the way the shadows moved, even when my light stayed still, that was harder to explain. I walked past the main assembly floor. Looms and spinning wheels stood in neat rows, their surfaces layered in dust thick enough to record footsteps or the absence of them. The machine's teeth and pulleys seemed poised to snap, even in stillness. I could hear a soft metallic rasp like someone dragging a key along the floor. I froze. There was no one there. Nothing moved, and yet the sound persisted, faint and deliberate. My pulse quickened, but I kept moving. I told myself I'd come to document, to record the stories this place might tell. But the stories already seemed to be watching me. I found the office at the far end of the floor. Its door hung crooked on rusted hinges, inviting and threatening at the same time. I pushed it gently, and the smell hit me. Paper, ink, mildew, and something almost sweet beneath it, like rot disguised as perfume. The room was small, lined with filing cabinets that had been yanked open and left ajar. Faded folders and yellowed papers littered the floor. I stepped carefully around them, noticing marks on the edges of the desk. Scratches, gouges, not deep, but deliberate, as if someone had been counting the minutes here with a knife. On the desk sat a bell, smaller than the one outside, its brass surface polished oddly, too clean for this decay. I ran my fingers over it, and it rang softly, a single, hollow note. My throat went dry. I hadn't touched it long enough for a sound that clear. Then the shadows shifted again. I spun, shining my light over the room, catching only dust motes floating in the beam. But the sense of being watched was growing, a weight pressing down on my shoulders and chest, making it hard to breathe. I walked along the line of machines, letting my fingertips brush the cool metal. My flashlight's beam trembled, though my hand didn't. The shadows seemed to lengthen and shorten as I passed, subtle and alive, as if the factory itself breathed in response to me. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed quietly, a sound so soft it could have been imagined. But I hadn't imagined the echo it left behind, the way it lingered in my chest. At the center of the floor, the largest loom still sat in place. Its massive gears looked like teeth frozen mid-bite. I crouched beside it, shining my light into the darkness underneath. The floor was sticky in patches, the residue of old oils and grime, and in the dim glow I thought I saw footprints. Small, human-sized, leading to the far wall. They weren't mine. And they weren't old, they were fresh enough to unsettle me. My heart thudded. I told myself to step back, to leave, but my feet stayed rooted, curiosity clawing through my fear. A whisper caught my ear, so faint I thought I had imagined it. "Leave," it breathed, the sound scraping like dry paper. I froze. Nothing moved, and yet the air seemed charged, vibrating with intent. I turned slowly, scanning the walls, the ceilings, the shadows pooling beneath the machines. My light flickered. A shadow detached from the wall, moving just a fraction too fast, just a fraction too fluid to belong to the mundane. I blinked and it was gone, but the sense of presence didn't leave. I found the stairs leading to the upper catwalks, the narrow metal bridge that ran across the factory like a spine. Each step groaned under me, louder than my own heartbeat. From above, I could see the floor below, the machines like slumbering giants, the scattered papers reflecting my beam in fragmented, mocking patterns. I paused mid-step, noticing the faint glint of something near the far wall, something metallic, shaped like a hand. I swallowed hard, stepping closer, and realized it was nothing but a pile of broken tools, yet my mind insisted it had been alive. Then the bell rang again, not outside, not in the office. It came from inside me, or from somewhere deeper in the factory that I couldn't reach. Each toll was slower than the last, dragging time into itself, stretching the minutes. I felt my pulse in the tips of my fingers, my ears straining for more than sound, for a pattern, for a reason. Why was it ringing? Who or what had lived here before me, leaving this echo behind? I moved toward the main machinery floor again, and the shadows shifted differently this time. Not random, not accidental. They seemed to respond to me, shrinking and stretching like breathing things. The metal groaned and clanked under some invisible weight. My chest tight. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and step back into the street where life felt normal, safe. But the pull of the factory, the need to understand, to see the pattern in the chaos, kept me moving forward. And that's when I noticed it. The small bell in the office, polished and clean, was no longer on the desk. It sat on the floor, inches from my shoe, though I hadn't touched it since I had rung it. I leaned down, fingers trembling, and it rang again. A soft, hollow note, just one, and in that note I felt the weight of every minute that had ever passed in this place. Every secret, every moment of fear, every silence. I shined my light around, heart hammering. The shadows weren't hiding anymore. They were watching, waiting, coiling around corners and machinery like smoke. And I realized in a sudden, icy clarity that the bell had never rung on its own. I had been part of it all along, part of the sound, part of the echo, part of the factory's long, patient memory. The stairs creaked behind me, a single soft footstep, not mine. I froze. I didn't move. And I wondered how many others had heard the bell before me. I stepped deeper into the factory, and the darkness seemed to stretch, thick and pliable, like liquid night pressing against my skin. The echo of my boots no longer felt empty. Each footfall had a weight, a resonance that lingered just long enough to suggest I was not alone. I told myself it was the shape of the room, the high ceilings, the hollow walls, but a cold part of me whispered otherwise. The floor was uneven here, scattered with debris and forgotten remnants of work. I crouched over a streak of dust and grime that hadn't been disturbed for decades until now. Footprints, not mine, fresh enough that the edges hadn't completely crumbled into the dust. They led toward the back of the factory where the machines were older, larger, more menacing in their silence. My pulse picked up. My mind ran through possibilities, workers sneaking back for nostalgia, vagrants hiding out, but nothing fit. These prints were careful, deliberate, measured. As I followed them, I noticed other details that didn't belong. A half-broken hammer lay at an odd angle against the wall. Its handle was splintered, edges darkened, almost like someone had tried to wedge it into the ground and failed. A wrench, too long and heavy for casual use, rested nearby. Rusted, yes, but polished in a way that suggested it had been moved recently. I bent down to examine it, fingers trembling, and felt the subtle warmth of old metal that had not entirely cooled. It was absurd, impossible even, and yet there it was. Between the machines, I found scraps of paper folded into tiny squares tucked behind support beams. I unfolded one carefully, brushing away decades of dust. Symbols, letters, numbers, shapes that made no sense. A journal. I opened it, the binding brittle, pages curling at the edges. The handwriting was uneven, jagged at times, almost desperate. I read silently. They are watching the bell. They remember every shift. Don't let the shadow catch you. Midnight comes for those who linger too long. I swallowed hard. The mention of the bell made my stomach knot. Could it be a warning? Or a trick left behind to unnerve anyone who wandered this far? I flipped the page. More notes, fragmented thoughts, sketches of machinery, hands, shadows. One page was smudged with something that looked like dried ink, or worse, dried blood. I set the journal down on a rusted metal surface and backed away slightly. The factory seemed to inhale, the air heavier, pressing against my chest like it wanted me to move deeper, or maybe it wanted me to stay. A soft scuffing noise made me freeze. Somewhere beyond the shadows, across the assembly floor, a foot shifted, barely audible but precise. I spun, shining my light toward the sound. Nothing. Just machines standing in a row, their belts and pulleys froze in mid-motion. But the scuff came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't random. Someone or something was moving methodically through the shadows. I followed the footprints carefully, stepping over debris and fallen metal, trying not to make a sound. They led me to a small office tucked into a corner, a room I hadn't noticed before. Its door was slightly ajar. The hinges were rusted, but there was a gap and a faint sliver of light or reflection leaked through. I crouched to peer inside. A desk, cluttered with broken tools and faded photographs of workers, lined the far wall. There was a chair pushed back as if someone had just left. I stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath my weight. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang I had smelled before, but sharper in a way that felt personal, intentional. The journal I had found earlier must have belonged here. More papers scattered the floor, notes scratched in a hurried hand. I knelt, scanning them. Some were calculations, charts of production and hours. Others were darker, lists of names, dates, cryptic reminders. Check the shift at 12. They always know. A memory flickered in my mind. Old newspaper clippings I had seen before mentioned a worker who vanished without trace, a night shift foreman who had been obsessed with the factory's machinery. Could these notes belong to him? Was he the one leaving behind these traces, still moving through the dark long after everyone else had left? The thought made the hairs on my neck rise, but curiosity pressed me forward. I noticed something else, marks on the floor leading away from the office. Not footprints this time, but smudges, dragged lines like someone had pulled an object along the floor. I followed them slowly, flashlight sweeping over every inch. The shadows seemed to stretch in response, folding differently as I moved. I imagined the drag marks ending at a machine, at a wall, but they didn't. They just stopped, abruptly, as if whatever had been moved had been taken out of reach, vanished into the factory itself. I crouched near the marks, heart hammering, trying to make sense of them. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something dark, half hidden beneath a pile of tarps. I approached cautiously. It was a box, wooden, splintered, heavy. I nudged it with my foot. It shifted slightly and I heard a soft creak inside. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were tools, old but oddly well maintained, and a small tin. I opened it. Inside were nails, screws, and photographs. Workers smiling, some waving at the camera, others froze in mid-motion, like they had just been interrupted. But one figure in every photo was always blurry, always half-hidden, as if the camera couldn't quite capture it. A chill ran down my spine. I put the tin back and looked around the room again. The shadows were thicker here, pooling in corners and under furniture. The hum of the machines from the main floor seemed to change, lower, almost like a growl. And then I noticed it, a footprint, fresh, leading from the desk toward the far window. The dust around it was slightly disturbed, pressed down, no other marks leading to it. But when I stepped closer, it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there at all. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The journal, the footprints, the drag marks, they all pointed to someone moving through this factory, someone meticulous, careful, almost ritualistic. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a trespasser, a scavenger, someone exploring the same way I was. But the feeling in my chest told me no. This was something else, something patient, watching, waiting. From somewhere beyond the office, I heard a faint metallic scrape. Not random, deliberate, measured. I froze. The sound came again, slightly closer. My flashlight beam swept over the floor, over the shadows, over the forgotten tools and the scattered papers. Nothing. And yet I felt it, felt the weight of presence, something unseen tracking me, leaving reminders of itself in every corner. I returned to the journal, flipping to another page. A note written hastily. Don't trust the echoes, they repeat what they see. They follow footsteps that aren't yours. Midnight always comes. My hand shook. Midnight? The bell. The echoes I had heard the first time I entered, the tolling that seemed to know me before I even stepped inside. I felt a pulse of dread, but also a strange thrill. I wanted to know more. I wanted to see where the next footprint would lead. I rose slowly and stepped toward the next hall, the footprints guiding me deeper, toward the center of the factory. The shadows followed, stretching and curling around machinery. Somewhere far away, a faint creak of metal suggested movement, something just beyond the reach of my light. I wondered if I was being watched, or if the factory itself was alive, recording, responding to me. My curiosity won over my fear. I had to see it. At the far end of the hallway, I found another office, smaller, less organized. The door was closed this time. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle. What was waiting inside? Another journal, another trace, something worse. I couldn't tell. I knew that whatever had left these footsteps had meant for someone, anyone, to follow them. I realized then that I was part of the trail now, caught in the narrative of a place that had never really ended. The handle turned with a soft groan. Inside, the room was darker, cooler. A single chair faced the wall, empty, yet somehow present, as if someone had just stood there. The floor beneath it bore marks, small depressions, as if it had been sat in for decades at a time, repeatedly. The shadows here were thicker, almost tactile, pressing gently, inviting me forward, warning me back. And on the desk, another journal. This one smaller, leather-bound, older. I opened it slowly. The first words jumped out at me. They see you. The footsteps are your own now. My stomach twisted. My heart raced. Every movement I had made, every footprint I left behind was now part of the pattern. The factory had recorded me, folded me into itself. And I realized then, with a sick thrill, that I was no longer following. I was being led. A soft whisper almost behind my ear, or maybe in my head, said, "Don't stop now. There is more to see." I didn't know whether to run or move forward. Curiosity burned brighter than fear. I stepped away from the desk, flashlight beam sweeping across the office, catching glimpses of more marks, more shadows. Every corner seemed to hide a story. Every sound hinted at another presence. I wondered who had left these footsteps, and if they were still here, somewhere in the dark, waiting. I left the office, the journal under my arm, and glanced at the hall behind me. The footprints continued, deeper into the factory, deeper into the unknown. I took a deep breath, knowing that each step forward would pull me further into the story, further into the echoes of those who had walked these halls long before me, and perhaps those who never left at all. And as I moved, I felt the factory breathe around me, alive, patient, waiting for the next step, the next sound, the next heartbeat to join its endless rhythm. The closer I got to the center of the factory, the heavier the air became, thick with dust, rust, and something I couldn't name, like the memory of machines that had worked too hard for too long. My flashlight caught on the edges of conveyor belts and gears, glinting faintly, but the shadows between them seemed to shift, almost like breathing. I stopped, mid-step, listening. A faint clatter echoed somewhere in the distance. Metal against metal, deliberate but too soft to be random. My pulse jumped. I froze. The sound repeated, closer this time, like someone or something was moving carefully through the machines, testing the floor, testing me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Old factories make noise, but then came the whisper. Not loud, not clear, just fragments. Don't leave midnight. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't my imagination. Not entirely. I took a slow step forward. The whisper dissolved, replaced by a dragging sound. Something heavy, metallic, moving along the floor. My flashlight beam swung across the machines. A shadow darted across the far wall, quick and fluid, vanishing before I could focus. I swallowed hard, keeping my movements slow, careful, trying not to disturb whatever or whoever was here. The factory felt alive, aware, patient. Between the machines, I found more scraps of paper, torn and faded. Notes about machinery, maintenance logs, sketches of tools, but one set stood out. Handwritten in jagged letters. He watches, he waits. The bell will call again. My chest tightened. Who was he? And which bell? The one outside? The small one in the office? Or something else entirely, something I hadn't discovered yet? I stepped closer to an old loom, its massive gears frozen mid-spin. The floor around it was scuffed, footprints pressed into the dust, overlapping as if someone had paced back and forth for hours or decades. I knelt, examining them. They were different from the ones I had followed earlier. Smaller, lighter, precise. Like a worker, meticulous, careful. But there was something off. The angles were too sharp, the spacing irregular, almost unnatural. A sudden metallic ping made me jump. Something hit the far wall or maybe fell. I swept the light around. Nothing. The whisper returned, faint, almost teasing. He comes for those who linger. I pressed forward, flashlight cutting swaths through the darkness. The machines seemed taller now, more imposing, their teeth and belts casting long, sinister shadows. Each step echoed, but faintly, as if the factory swallowed the sound, keeping it close, letting me hear it only a heartbeat later. I noticed the walls were scarred, scratched lines running vertically and horizontally, some deep enough to catch the beam. Old accidents, maybe, or warnings. The air smelled heavier here, metallic, almost like blood mixed with oil. My stomach churned. I had read about accidents in factories, workers trapped, tools slipping, machinery running too fast, but these marks felt different, intentional, deliberate, a language written into the walls, waiting for someone to understand. I moved past a row of spinning wheels, and the sound of whispers seemed to surround me, layered, echoing like a crowd of voices just behind my perception. Words I couldn't make out, voices rising and falling in pitch and intensity. My mind raced, trying to separate fact from fear. Were they memories of the workers, or warnings? One phrase landed clearly. Follow the sound. Don't stop. My heartbeat thrummed in time with my steps. Then I noticed something that made me stop cold. A pair of gloves, faded and stiff, lay draped over a railing. Not just any gloves, they were the kind a night shift worker might wear, thick with grime and oil. But the cuffs were bent, twisted oddly as if someone had pressed their hands into the air, then vanished. I knelt and reached out, fingers brushing the fabric. The whispering grew, layered now, more insistent, almost pleading. He remembers, he always remembers. I stepped back and glanced at the loom again. Shadows shifted differently now, not cast by my light but by some unseen motion. I caught a glimpse of something moving behind the machine, a figure. I swung the light quickly and the space was empty. My chest tightened, but a part of me knew it hadn't been nothing. The factory was replaying something, or showing me something I couldn't fully comprehend yet. Between two machines, I spotted a small notebook wedged under a beam. I picked it up, dusting off decades of grime. The pages were brittle, the writing frantic. He watches every shift. No one leaves unnoticed. Footsteps in the dark are not yours. Midnight calls for those who stay too long. Remember the bell. My hands trembled. Every word felt like it had been written for me, for my ears alone. The patterns, the echoes, the whispers, the footprints were leading somewhere, and I was trapped in the rhythm. I moved further along the row, flashlights sweeping over belts, pulleys, and the skeletons of machines long forgotten. The whispers grew more insistent. I leaned closer to the floor, catching something almost imperceptible, a small metallic click, like a wrench dropped or a key turned. The sound came again in a pattern, repeating every few seconds. I followed it, and it led me toward the far end of the factory, near a stairwell I hadn't noticed before. The stairs creaked as I climbed, each step resonating like a note in a minor chord. Shadows pooled at the edges, wrapping around the rusted railing. The whispers faded slightly, replaced by the subtle hum of the machinery below. I could feel the weight of the factory pressing in, dense, expectant. Something waited above, something patient, something that had been here long before me and would remain long after. At the top of the stairs, I reached a catwalk overlooking the main floor. The machines stretched out like a forest of metal, their teeth and belts casting jagged shadows. I leaned against the railing, flashlight scanning the expanse. Somewhere down below, a shadow flickered. I blinked and it was gone. But then came a faint clatter, a bucket tipped over, a tool rolled. I wasn't sure and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I noticed the air here was colder, carrying whispers that seemed closer, more directed. Do not turn back. Follow the sound. I gritted my teeth. The logical part of me wanted to leave, wanted the warmth and safety outside, but curiosity and something darker, something drawn to the patterns of the factory, kept me moving. Along the catwalk, I found another desk, smaller, abandoned. Papers scattered the surface, more notes, more sketches of machinery and figures in motion. One sketch caught my eye, a figure leaning against a loom, a bell overhead, shadows stretching unnaturally. It was the same figure I had glimpsed in the photographs, the blurred presence in every image. I traced the lines with my finger. The sketch was crude, rushed, yet the figure's presence was palpable. The whispers shifted again. They seemed to move, following me, circling the catwalk. I froze, straining to hear each syllable, each fragment of a sentence. He will come. You cannot leave. Midnight, the bell. The words were fragments, but their intent was clear. Someone or something remembered. Someone or something had not forgiven. A small cabinet leaned against the railing, one door slightly open. I approached, flashlight illuminating the inside. Old tools, wrenches, hammers, and a small tin box. I lifted it carefully. Inside were nails, screws, and photographs. The same haunting images I had seen before, workers frozen in mid-motion, always with that same blurred figure lurking in the background. My stomach twisted. Each photo felt alive, as if it could move when I wasn't looking. I set the tin down and leaned back, trying to steady my breath. The whispers had not stopped. They had grown, layering over each other, creating a low hum that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the machines themselves. Somewhere deep within the factory, a faint metallic ping echoed again, regular and deliberate. I realized it was a rhythm, a pattern. Someone or something was signaling, or warning. My gaze returned to the main floor below. Shadows pooled near the machines, stretching unnaturally, folding over themselves. I caught a glimpse of movement again, a figure slipping between machines, faster than I could track. My pulse quickened. Was it human, something else? The sketches, the notes, the photographs, they were all connected, but how? The factory seemed to know I was searching for answers, feeding me breadcrumbs while keeping the truth just out of reach. A chill ran down my spine. I realized that every step I had taken, every footprint I had followed, every whisper I had heard, it had been guiding me, shaping me. I was not just an observer. I was part of the story, folded into the rhythm of the factory, caught in its memory. And somewhere in the distance, faint but insistent, the bell rang again, slow and hollow, echoing through the machines, through the shadows. Through me. I froze. My flashlight caught on a shadow moving across the far wall behind a loom, but when I blinked it was gone. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. Do not stop. He waits for those who linger too long. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. I knew then that I couldn't leave, not yet. The factory had secrets, and it would not release them easily. Each sound, each shadow, each echo of the bell was part of a pattern I had yet to understand. I took a deep breath and moved forward, following the whispers, following the clattering, following the unseen presence that had been guiding me all along. Every step felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the factory itself was testing me, measuring my resolve. And I realized something terrifying. The worker who had disappeared decades ago, the one mentioned in the journal, might not have left at all. The shadows seemed to pulse, shifting as I moved along the catwalk. The whispers followed, circling, teasing, urging me onward. Somewhere deep in the factory, a soft metallic scrape repeated, marking time, marking me, marking the story that had been unfolding long before I arrived. And I understood with a sick clarity that I had stepped into a rhythm I could not escape, a rhythm that belonged to the factory, to the bell, to the unseen figure who had never left. I leaned against the railing, heart pounding, flashlight shaking in my grip. The bell tolled again, slow and deliberate. The whispers surged, layered, overlapping, filling the catwalk, the floor below, the space around me. I shivered. The factory was alive, patient, aware. And I was not alone. The factory seemed quieter than ever, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it, the air itself pulsing with a memory that wasn't mine. Each breath I drew tasted metallic, thick, carrying echoes of 1,000 lost shifts. The floor beneath me groaned softly, as if testing my presence. I had thought I understood the building, its shadows, its whispers, but now I realized I had only scratched the surface. Every machine held a story. Every pulley, belt, and gear remembered. I could almost see the workers who had once moved here, their faces blurred in the dust, their hands still gripping levers that had rusted long ago. I walked slowly, deliberately, trying to feel my way through the layers of history, but the factory didn't let me move casually. It guided me, shifted me, pressed my senses against the past. The faint hum that had been under everything all night became louder, a vibration through the soles of my boots. I stopped, heart hammering, listening. It wasn't coming from any one machine. It was everywhere, the sum of every motor, every spinning wheel, every whispering memory. And within it, I thought I heard footsteps, not mine. They were light, careful, deliberate, circling me, following. I forced myself to take a deep breath, telling myself it was imagination, that the place was old and creaking. But then a shadow moved across the wall, flickering as though it had a life of its own. My flashlight swung toward it. Nothing. I blinked. The darkness felt thicker, closer. The space between me and the machine seemed to shrink, as though the factory were leaning in, listening. I reached a row of looms, half frozen in their eternal motion. The dust here was deep, soft, undisturbed for decades, yet my boots pressed down with a sickening crunch like stepping into bones. And then I saw it, handprints on the dust, smeared, frantic. They were small, delicate, not mine. Someone had been here before me recently, or had never left. A whisper curled in my ear, barely audible. "Don't stop, not yet." I spun around, flashlight swinging, but the catwalks above me were empty. The shadows moved differently now, subtly, almost teasingly. Shapes that weren't quite human, but not quite machines, sliding through the corners of my vision. Every time I thought I caught one, it was gone, leaving only dust and silence. I pressed forward toward the heart of the factory, where the air felt thickest and the echoes of labor lingered strongest. Here, the walls were scarred more deeply, with grooves that told of something violent or desperate. I knelt, running my fingers across the marks. They weren't random, they were messages, directions, or warnings. My hand shook. The notes from the journal, the photographs, the gloves, they all pointed toward this place, the nucleus of the factory's memory. I reached a central platform where the main machines used to grind and spin relentlessly. Even frozen in silence, they seemed alive, bristling with energy. Shadows pooled in their crevices, dark and waiting. The hum was louder here, almost musical, vibrating through my chest. I pressed my palm to the cold metal of a gear. A shiver ran through me. The factory remembered every touch, every shift, every hand that had faltered, and every scream that had gone unheard. Then I saw them, figures faint, blurred, emerging from the shadows. They moved as though underwater, slow and deliberate. Faces pale, eyes hollow. They mimicked actions I didn't recognize at first, wrenching levers, tightening belts, spinning wheels. But I realized these were the last motions of workers lost in time, replaying their final shifts over and over. Their lips moved, whispering fragments I couldn't catch. My skin crawled. I felt like an intruder in someone else's grief, their panic, their endless repetition. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. I stumbled back, but my boots caught on something, a tool old and half buried in dust. I picked it up, shaking, heart racing. The figures paused, then resumed, their motions synchronized, mechanical, haunted. And I realized with a chill that the factory wasn't just remembering, it was showing me, teaching me, warning me, telling me that I was next if I lingered too long. A metallic clang echoed, startling me. I spun. A wheel that had been frozen all night creaked, moving slightly. The figures reacted instantly, bending toward it as if drawn by an unseen force. I realized then that these weren't just ghosts. They were trapped in a rhythm, tethered to the machinery, unable to leave. And the factory itself was orchestrating it, holding them here, preserving the echoes of every last shift. I backed away, flashlight trembling. The The shadows stretched, reaching toward me now. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but patiently, insistently. The whispers merged into one low hum, vibrating in my skull. He never left, you will see. I couldn't move. My hands gripped the flashlight tighter, knuckles white. The figures swirled around me, replaying memories that weren't mine, yet pressed so close to reality that they felt as real as my own heartbeat. Then I saw him, the worker who had disappeared decades ago. He stood apart, taller than the others, face obscured by shadow. His motions were slower, deliberate, different. He turned toward me just slightly, enough for me to see a glint of recognition or warning in the blurred outline of his eyes. My pulse raced. Was he alive, a ghost, or something else bound to the factory's memory watching me? The hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest, matching my heartbeat, as if the factory itself were synchronizing to our presence. I stumbled toward the exit, but the catwalks had shifted. The path I had taken to get here no longer existed as I remembered it. Shadows pooled where there had been open floor, and gaps yawned where the steps should have been. I realized with a surge of panic that the factory wasn't just replaying the past, it was rearranging itself, controlling me, trapping me within the rhythm of the final shift. I stopped, breathing heavily, flashlight scanning the expanse. The figures froze for a moment, their motion synchronized, then resumed, looping endlessly. My eyes caught a bell above the central platform, small and tarnished, swinging slightly, though there was no wind. The same bell from the photographs, the journal, the whispers. Its movement was subtle, hypnotic. I felt drawn to it, a pull I couldn't resist. Every instinct screamed to run, but curiosity rooted me in place. I inched closer, the hum growing louder, vibrations crawling through my bones. The bell tolled softly, once, twice. Each note resonated through the machinery, and the figures below reacted, twisting, pausing, repeating. I realized then that this was the climax of the factory's memory, the apex of its obsession. And the vanished worker, he was the final note, the end of the rhythm that had trapped everyone else. The air grew colder, carrying whispers now clear enough to understand. Stay, witness. Do not forget the last shift. My legs shook. I could feel my mind teetering, pushed to the edge by the weight of decades of labor, fear, and unseen eyes. The factory wasn't haunted. It was alive, conscious, replaying its own history, rewriting it with each newcomer foolish enough to enter. I reached out and touched the bell. The hum surged, nearly deafening, filling every inch of space. The shadows below stilled, faces turned toward me, waiting. The vanished worker stepped closer, hand raised but not threateningly. His gesture was almost imploring, urging me to see, to understand, to bear witness. My heart pounded, my head spun. The factory's memory pressed into me, forcing me to relive the last moments of its lost souls. Time distorted. Seconds stretched into minutes. The figures below repeated their motions endlessly, as if caught in a loop that could never end. I could see every panic-stricken glance, every slip of a hand, every scream swallowed by the walls. And through it all, the worker who had disappeared decades ago watched, patient, eternal. I understood then that the factory had claimed him, but it had preserved him, a sentinel of the past, guiding me through the rhythm it demanded I witness. I staggered back, trembling. The bell's tolls softened and the hum receded slightly, leaving a ringing in my ears. My flashlight scanned the floor. The figures remained, frozen in mid-motion, suspended between past and present. I felt a strange calm amid the terror, a clarity that came from understanding the factory's intent. It didn't kill, it preserved, it repeated, it taught. It demanded recognition. And yet, as I turned to leave, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The catwalks, the shadows, the figures, they had shifted again. The path I had entered by was gone. The exit was obscured by darkness and looming machinery. The factory was patient, and it had more to show me, more to test, more to teach. And I was still part of its rhythm, caught in the echo of the final shift. The bell tolled once more, soft but deliberate. A whisper followed. "You will remember, and you will return," I shivered, knowing it wasn't a threat. It was inevitability. The factory's consciousness lingered, eternal, replaying the final shift for anyone who dared to step inside. And as I took a tentative step forward, I realized the lingering dread wasn't just the shadows, the whispers, or the figures. It was the understanding that the factory had claimed a piece of me too. The gates were heavier than I expected, even though rust had eaten away most of the metal. They groaned as I pushed them, a long, tortured sound that echoed across the yard. The smell hit me first, a mix of stale oil, metal, and something that didn't belong in a factory, a coppery tang that made the back of my throat tight. I took a step forward, boots crunching over broken glass and scattered bolts. The shadows between the piles of scrap seemed thicker than the night around them, as if the darkness had gathered here while the world moved on. I had come here thinking I understood what abandonment looked like. I was wrong. This place felt alive in a way that was not welcoming. The metal fences shivered with the wind, though there was barely a breeze, and every small movement in the yard made me pause, heart quickening. I couldn't tell if the shifting shapes were real or if my eyes were trying to make sense of too much dark. But the moment my flashlight flickered on, the shadows became sharper, angles more threatening. The factory loomed beyond the gates like a hulking memory, windows broken, walls scarred by years of neglect. The gate rattled behind me as I let go, and I realized how alone I truly was. Even the air seemed hesitant, heavy with history. I stepped closer to the factory entrance, noticing the faded signs warning of danger, warnings long ignored. My hand brushed against a nearby pipe, rust flacking into my palm. I tasted iron. There were footprints here, faint, old, partially covered by debris but not entirely erased. Someone had been here before me, or maybe they hadn't left. The smell grew stronger as I moved toward the doorway, metallic now, sharp, almost warm, as if the building exhaled it when it sensed a new presence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing jagged edges of machinery frozen mid-motion. Conveyor belts sagged, spools of wire lay scattered like dead snakes, and the floor was slick in places, reflecting the weak beam in pale streaks. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud. I tried to swallow down a rising panic, telling myself that echoes were normal in empty factories, but something in the air told me they weren't just echoes. Inside the factory was a cathedral of rust and shadow. I could hear a faint dripping somewhere deep within, slow and rhythmic, a pulse I couldn't place. The smell was stronger here, mingled now with something sweet and almost rotten. I moved carefully, eyes scanning. Broken machinery stood like sentinels, towering and silent, yet somehow watching. A loose chain clinked in the distance. I didn't move toward it, but I couldn't stop glancing, convinced something would emerge from the darkness if I stared too long. I found a hallway of offices along one wall, doors hanging crooked on their hinges. Papers littered the floor, yellowed and curling. Faded photographs tacked to corkboards showed men and women with stern faces, all wearing the same gray uniforms. Their eyes seemed to follow me, and I had to force myself to look away. Something about the stillness of this place was wrong. It didn't feel empty, it felt patient. I could sense it waiting, remembering, holding on to a history that refused to fade. I continued forward, boots careful on the warped wooden floor, each step squeaking like a warning. Then I saw it, a faint smear on the wall, dark against the peeling paint, streaked like something had been dragged. I swallowed hard. My mind refused the thought that it could be old grease or rust. There was an unmistakable sense of urgency in it, like a trace left behind in a hurry. I pressed on, though every instinct screamed to leave. I didn't know why I was here, really, other than curiosity. But now curiosity felt like a tether holding me in a place I didn't fully understand. The main workshop opened before me like a vast cavern, ceiling high and blackened with years of smoke and oil. Massive presses stood silent, their steel frames scarred, belts frozen mid-rotation. Shadows pooled between the machines, dark and unnatural. I noticed an old control panel, buttons worn down, some missing entirely. I ran a finger across them. Dust lifted, swirling in the beam of my flashlight, and for a moment I imagined the machine starting again, moving, grinding, and the sound of human screams filling the air. I shivered, shaking my head. That was ridiculous. It was impossible, but the fear lingered, creeping under my skin. I moved deeper, noticing the walls were lined with graffiti scrawled in hurried, uneven letters. Some of it was just names or dates, but a few phrases made me stop. "Don't let it see you," and "he waits in the machines." My chest tightened. I didn't know who he was or why it mattered. The words were old, faded, but somehow fresh. It was as if someone had written them yesterday, warning me in their absence. I wanted to dismiss it as childish vandalism, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach refused. Something here was aware, something remembered. The further I went, the louder the air became with the smell of metal and oil, but now I thought I could hear a subtle undertone, almost like whispers. They weren't coherent, just fragments, soft murmurs that tugged at the edge of hearing. I paused, holding my breath. A loose sheet of metal shifted in the corner. I spun my flashlight toward it. Nothing, but the shadow it had cast seemed to linger, stretching longer than it should. My pulse raced, and I felt the beginnings of a deep unease, the kind that doesn't leave with a rational explanation. I reached a set of stairs leading to a catwalk above the workshop. They groaned under my weight, rust flacking off like dry skin. From above, I could see the full expanse of the factory floor, broken machines, scattered debris, and the long shadows pooling between them. The space felt infinite, though I knew it was confined. It felt alive. Not alive in the biological sense, but aware, watching, waiting. And somewhere deep in the darkness, I could swear I saw movement, a flicker that didn't belong to any shadow or machine. I blinked. It was gone, or maybe it had been waiting for me to notice. The faint smell of something metallic mixed with decay grew stronger as I walked the catwalk. I leaned over, looking down at the machines, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure, hunched and pale, slipping between the gears. My stomach twisted. It moved too fluidly for a human, too deliberate for a shadow. I forced myself to step back, heart pounding, telling myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, that the place was playing tricks. But the cold sweat on my neck and the metallic taste in my mouth told me my body wasn't convinced. I kept moving, catwalk creaking with each step. Above me, the ceiling was a lattice of rusted beams, some sagging dangerously. I imagined them collapsing, trapping me beneath decades of metal and dust. And then I heard it, a faint clinking like chains brushing against metal. Not close, not immediate, but surrounding. It bounced from wall to wall, and the whispers returned, growing in clarity as if they were forming words just out of reach. "He remembers, you remember, stay." My chest tightened again. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't want to know. Yet I couldn't leave. At the far end of the catwalk, I found a door, half-latched and rusted. It swung inward with an uneasy squeal. Beyond it was a narrow hallway, darker than the workshop, the air heavy, pressing against my lungs. My flashlight flickered briefly as if protesting the darkness. I stepped forward. Dust motes swirled like tiny ghosts in the beam. And then I noticed footprints, fresh, muddy, and leading deeper into the darkness. Someone had been here recently, or they had never left. I swallowed, a lump in my throat. The factory had been waiting. Not for me, not exactly, but for someone, for anyone who could witness what it held. The footprints led onward, toward the heart of the building, where the smell of oil and metal was strongest. And beyond that, I wasn't sure. But something in me ached with a terrible curiosity. I had to follow. I had to see. As I stepped off the catwalk, leaving the faint safety of height, the shadows seemed to bend, stretching toward me. The whispers grew more insistent. The factory exhaled a cold, metallic breath, and I realized that what I was about to uncover was not just old machines and rust. It was memory, presence, and something that had been waiting decades to replay itself. And now, it had me. The moment I stepped fully inside, the floor told a story I wasn't ready for. Dark stains marred the concrete, jagged and irregular, almost like blood left to dry in fragments. They were old, faded, but not gone, like memories etched into the very floor itself. I crouched to examine one, feeling the cold of the concrete seep through my clothes, and the faint metallic smell made me swallow hard. It wasn't fresh, yet it smelled alive in a way that twisted my stomach. I shook my head, trying to tell myself it was oil or rust, but my gut knew better. The air here was thicker, heavier than the main hall. Dust motes floated lazily in the weak beam of my flashlight, moving with the faint drafts that whispered through broken windows. Every sound seemed amplified. A dripping pipe, the faint scrape of a loose piece of metal somewhere far off, the soft hum of my own breath. I stepped carefully, boots pressing against the uneven surface, leaving tiny prints in a fine layer of ash and grime. My eyes kept darting toward the stains, as if expecting them to shift, as if expecting them to watch. I noticed a door slightly ajar at the far end of the hall. Something about it drew me, though I couldn't say why. The hinges groaned as I pushed it, a long, deliberate sound that seemed to echo back at me in fragments. Inside, the space was small, almost claustrophobic, filled with personal belongings frozen in time. Old coats hung on rusted hooks, hats slouched against the wall. A desk sat crooked in the corner, papers stacked haphazardly, and the faint smell of old ink and dust filled the air. I ran a finger over the surface of the desk. The wood was rough, splintered in places. Among the papers were photographs. Workers posed stiffly, smiles tight, eyes that seemed to follow me despite the years. I recognized the uniform, the same gray fabric I'd seen in the old photographs in the main hall. I turned one over. A name, barely legible, and a date decades old. The handwriting was neat but hurried, like someone writing in secret. My chest tightened. These were people, real people who had spent their lives here, whose routines had ended, leaving only traces like ghosts. The stains on the floor now felt connected to this room, as if the building had exhaled its history directly into my path. Some were large, blotchy, as though something heavy had fallen. Others were thin, like someone had dragged their hands across the concrete in desperation. I noticed a faint smear that led toward a gap in the wall where the plaster had fallen away. Shadows pooled there, darker than the rest, almost waiting. I swallowed, feeling the familiar twist of dread curl through my stomach. Something had moved here, something had struggled, or perhaps it had been taken. I pulled open a drawer in the desk. Inside were small personal objects, a tarnished pocket watch, a notebook with pages filled with careful scrawls, and a rusted key. The notebook fell open as I lifted it, and I stared at the writing. It was a log, dates and times, notes about machines and shifts, and then entries that didn't make sense. "The hum follows me," one said. "I see him in the gears." My hand trembled slightly as I traced the words. A chill ran through me. Someone had been scared here, writing for a time when no one would read, leaving a trace of their fear behind. I moved to the wall opposite the desk. There were shelves lined with cups, old lunch boxes, and small trinkets. Each item was coated in dust, yet seemed almost deliberate, arranged as if someone might return at any moment. I picked up a small cup, the porcelain chipped, and held it to the light. Inside, the stain of dried liquid glimmered faintly red in the beam. My breath caught. It didn't belong here. I set it down gently, almost afraid to disturb the silence. The whispering began again, soft and distant, just at the edge of hearing. I froze, straining to catch words. I thought I could hear laughter, low and trembling, and then a sigh, long and heavy, like someone had carried a burden for decades. The sound made my skin crawl, but I couldn't leave. The room demanded attention, demanded that I notice the traces of lives lived and ended here. Every object, every stain, every scrawl in that notebook seemed to tug me deeper into a story that refused to stay buried. I crouched again, following one particular streak across the floor. It led toward a narrow crawl space beneath the shelving. I hesitated. It was barely big enough for a person, yet the stain continued inside. I pressed my flashlight through the opening. The light fell on a small pile of objects, shoes, a cap, a tattered coat. It was like someone had vanished mid-shift, leaving everything behind as though the building itself had swallowed them. I felt the first real spike of fear. This wasn't just history. Something lingered here, watching, remembering. My mind tried to reason it away. People disappear all the time. Accidents happen. Factories are dangerous. But even as I told myself that, I noticed the way the air seemed to pulse around the crawl space, the faint metallic tang growing stronger, almost tasting like blood on my tongue. I recoiled instinctively. My flashlight flickered. I shook it, trying to dismiss the sensation of eyes on me, but the unease had already settled in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. I stepped back, scanning the room again. The shadows shifted slightly, though there was no wind. The coats on the hook seemed to lean toward me, the photographs tilting, faces in the frame seeming more lifelike than they had seconds ago. I realized the stains on the floor weren't random. They were patterns, movements, traces of panic, traces of final moments. My stomach churned with the weight of it. These weren't just abandoned belongings. They were evidence. Evidence of life ending here, in small, desperate increments, unnoticed by the world outside. A draft moved across my neck and I shivered. Something whispered closer now, almost audible, a voice that seemed to slide through the room. "He's watching," I spun, flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the room remained empty, or empty enough. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I told myself to calm down, to breathe. But the metallic smell was overpowering now, mingling with a faint, sweet decay, and I couldn't shake the impression that the factory itself was alive, cataloging my presence, measuring my fear. I noticed a small trapdoor in the corner, half hidden beneath a layer of grime and scattered debris. It wasn't locked, but it was heavy, coated in years of dust and rust. The stains on the floor seemed to converge toward it. I bent down, brushing the grime away, revealing scratches, deliberate marks, not random. Someone had tried to get in, or out. I hesitated, flashlight trembling in my hand, aware that whatever lingered here might not take kindly to intruders. Yet the compulsion to see, to understand, overpowered the fear. I lifted the trapdoor. A hollow darkness yawned beneath it, the air inside cold and stale, carrying that same metallic tang. I didn't want to look down, but I couldn't stop myself. The space was narrow, just wide enough for a person, and littered with broken machinery and old crates. And then I saw it, a pair of boots, partially hidden, coated in dust, but shaped like someone had just stepped out. My pulse skipped. My rational mind told me they were old, left decades ago. Yet a part of me refused to believe it. Something had been here. Something had waited. I closed the trapdoor slowly, almost reverently, my hands shaking. The room felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in. I took a step back, noticing the photographs again. Faces seemed darker, expressions heavier. And in one corner, a coat hung slightly differently than before. I could have sworn it had shifted. My stomach lurched. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was aware. Every stain, every object, every faint whisper in the air had a story, and I was now part of it. I left the hidden office reluctantly, boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. The stains followed me in my mind, haunting the spaces between my footsteps. I realized that the factory had more stories to tell, more secrets pressed into every beam, every machine. And somewhere deeper within the dark heart of the building, the voices waited, patient and deliberate, waiting for me to follow, waiting for me to see what had been lost, and perhaps what could still be found. The farther I went into the factory, the heavier the air became. Dust hung like smoke, settling into every corner, every crevice. I felt it pressing against my skin, clinging to my hair, seeping into my lungs. It was a smell I couldn't place, part rust, part oil, part something old that hadn't been touched in decades. My boots echoed off the concrete floor, uneven and cracked, and each echo felt like it was answering back, as if the building itself were aware I was here. I found the first clue by accident. A wall, long forgotten and half hidden behind stacked crates, bore strange scratches. At first I thought they were just accidental scrapes from years of moving heavy objects. But the lines were deliberate, jagged but patterned, like someone had been trying to leave a message. I crouched closer, running a finger along the rough grooves. Numbers, letters, symbols I couldn't immediately decipher. The deeper I looked, the more they pressed against my memory, teasing me, hinting at a story I wasn't yet allowed to fully see. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, and the flash caught something else, scratches that weren't on the wall before, or maybe I hadn't noticed them. They formed a sequence, a kind of tally, and then a name scrawled hastily underneath, Harrison. My stomach tightened. I remembered the reports I had read in the police files, Foreman Harrison, missing without a trace decades ago. The more I looked, the more it felt like he hadn't left at all. He had been absorbed into this place, erased from history but remembered in marks left on walls, in dust, in shadows. I moved further down the corridor, following the patterns. The hallway narrowed, the air growing colder. Every step seemed to stir the space behind me, small echoes of movement though nothing followed. And then I saw them, more marks, symbols etched into the concrete walls and numbers carved with precision. One sequence repeated over and over like a countdown. 1473, I felt my pulse quicken. It was a warning or a record. I didn't know which, but the rhythm of it was hypnotic, a silent drum in the emptiness. A sudden creak made me freeze. Somewhere above, maybe a ceiling beam shifting, maybe nothing at all. My flashlight shook slightly in my grip as I looked up, expecting to see the source, but the shadows swallowed everything. I told myself it was just the building settling, decades of neglect twisting metal and wood into unrecognizable forms. Yet my chest tightened, and I could feel the unmistakable prickle at the back of my neck. The factory wasn't silent. It was alive in subtle ways, keeping time with things I didn't yet understand. I came across an office, its door slightly ajar like a secret waiting for me. Inside, the room smelled sharper, the metallic tang more concentrated. Paperwork lay scattered across a desk. Among the files were police reports, old photographs, and a personal log, Harrison's log. I hesitated, then picked it up. The pages were yellowed, brittle, edges curling as if the paper itself was recoiling from the weight of its contents. His handwriting was neat, meticulous, but something shifted in tone halfway down the first page. Urgency, fear, despair. I hear them whispering behind the machines, one entry said. They watch me when the lights go out. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. The words stabbed at me. I could almost hear the faint sound of a machine somewhere in the distance, low and steady, humming in time with my heartbeat. I flipped further. Numbers on the walls, they speak. They want me to follow. I looked up. My flashlight trembled slightly as the beam swept across the office walls. Symbols, numbers, scratches, the same kind I had seen outside. It was like Harrison had documented them, but he hadn't survived whatever followed. I felt a chill move down my spine. Every instinct screamed to leave, but curiosity, terrifying, irresistible curiosity, pulled me closer. I noticed the corner of the room where the wall met the floor. Faint footprints, dusted in decades of grime, led to a small vent partially hidden by a cabinet. I crouched, tracing the prints. They were small, deliberate, almost cautious. They stopped at the vent, and then they seemed to vanish. My heart hammered against my ribs. Harrison had gone in there, or maybe he had been taken. A low sound made me spin around, just a hum, distant and mechanical. Yet something in the rhythm felt wrong, uneven, almost like a breath. I shook my head. The air seemed to thicken, vibrating subtly, carrying whispers that I couldn't yet catch. Follow, follow. I wasn't sure if the voice was real or my mind straining against the silence. Either way, I felt it inside my bones. The factory remembered. It remembered Harrison. It remembered everything. I moved toward a far wall where scratches formed a crude arrow, pointing down a narrow staircase I hadn't seen before. The wood groaned under my weight as I descended. Dust swirled around my boots, dancing in the beam of my flashlight. Faint shapes loomed in the corners of my vision. Machinery long dead, rusted tools stacked as though waiting to be used, shadows that weren't quite shadows. The deeper I went, the louder the hum became. Low, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, yet metallic and unfeeling. The numbers reappeared on the walls. 1473, they spiraled downward, repeating a countdown, or a record. I didn't know, but the repetition made me dizzy, disoriented. And then I saw a symbol I hadn't noticed before, a jagged circle scratched roughly but unmistakably deliberate. Harrison had drawn it over and over, almost like a signature, a warning, or a plea. I traced it with my finger, cold, sharp. It burned in my mind. I heard a shuffle behind me, soft, deliberate, careful. I spun, flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing, only dust motes drifting. My pulse spiked. The shadows seemed to deepen, cling closer, almost like they had substance, almost like they could push back. The air tasted metallic again. I realized I could feel a presence in the room, patient, observing, waiting for me to understand something I wasn't supposed to yet. I moved past the vent, following a thin passage where the air grew colder still. Small objects littered the ground. A wrench, a broken clock, a hat pressed into dust. Each object felt like a message, a breadcrumb left for someone who might follow. I stooped to pick up the clock. The hands were stopped at 3:17. I held it to the light. My reflection appeared in the glass briefly, and I thought I saw movement behind me, a shadow that didn't belong. My throat tightened. The air vibrated with tension, anticipation, something I couldn't name. Then I heard it, a whisper unmistakable right beside my ear. "Do you see?" I whirled, flashlight swinging wildly. Nothing. Only the walls, scratched and numbered, symbols pressed into concrete like a code I couldn't yet read. My fingers brushed against another set of scratches, smaller, deliberate, forming letters. Harrison, the name repeated, etched again and again, like the building refused to let him be forgotten. My chest tightened, cold sweat slicking my palms. I stumbled further down the corridor and the numbers began to shift subtly. 1473, but now they weren't linear. Some were crossed out, some doubled, patterns I couldn't yet understand. And then I saw the final mark, a deep gouge in the wall, the deepest yet, almost as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Dust fell from it when I traced it. Behind the gouge, faint light leaked through cracks, just enough to make me wonder what lay beyond. I realized Harrison might have left this mark the moment he vanished. Or perhaps it was left for me. A low hum rose in intensity, vibrating in my chest. The numbers on the walls pulsed faintly with the rhythm, though I could see nothing electrical. The floor beneath me shivered, or maybe it was me. I felt the weight of every missing worker, every unspoken story pressing against me. The factory wasn't dead. It was cataloging, remembering, waiting. And in some small, horrifying way, it acknowledged me as part of its record now. I stepped back, shaking. The symbols, the scratches, the numbers, they weren't just history. They were alive, replaying the last movements of someone who had disappeared, leaving traces that twisted through time. Harrison had vanished into the machinery, into the floor, into the very walls. And the deeper I went, the more I realized. I might not be alone, and this place might never let me leave either. The furnace room was warmer than I expected, but the heat didn't comfort me. It pressed against my skin, sticky and unnatural, and I could hear it humming. A low, steady hum, almost like it was breathing. I froze. The sound felt deliberate, aware, as though the room itself were alive and waiting to test me. Shadows stretched long across the walls, cast by the flickering remnants of broken lights. They weren't just shadows. They moved subtly, in ways human shapes shouldn't, like they were watching me, mimicking me just out of sync. I took a cautious step forward. The floor was uneven, metal plates warped by years of heat. My boots clanged, and I felt a ripple of vibration in the soles of my feet, as if the furnace room were reacting to my presence. The hum rose and fell in response. I stopped, heart thudding, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but then a shadow shifted behind a rusted pipe. I spun. Nothing. Only the warped metal, the old soot stains, the whispering heat. I noticed the first mark almost instinctively, a smear of something dark on the furnace door. Dried, thick. It could have been oil, it could have been blood, I didn't want to know, yet I couldn't look away. Beside it, faint scratches formed a circle, jagged and deliberate, etched deep enough to feel with my fingertips. I traced the grooves. Cold, metallic. There was intent here, a message left by someone or something that had been trapped in this room long before me. The shadows seemed to lean closer. One formed a shape that was almost a person, hunched, watching me with impossible stillness. I blinked. It was gone, but the feeling lingered, a weight pressing into my chest, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Not truly. The furnace thrummed, low and insistent, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, almost like a heartbeat. Or maybe it was the room's pulse, recording my own. I moved deeper, towards a corner where the heat was most intense. Rusted grates lined the walls, pipes groaning and hissing in small bursts of air and steam. The smell of metal and oil was overwhelming, and beneath it, something sweeter, iron-like, clung to the back of my throat. My fingers brushed against a pipe and the hum shifted, lower, almost a warning. I froze. A cold dread pressed into me. Whatever had left its mark here was aware. A sudden shift in the shadows made me step back. Shapes elongated, twisted as though mocking me. I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure crouched low by the far furnace. My flashlight flickered. For a second the figure seemed human, then distorted as if the room itself had warped it. I swallowed hard. I couldn't leave, not yet. I needed to understand. I had to see what the furnace room wanted me to see. On the wall, numbers were scratched. 2114-7. They were the same sequence I'd seen before, repeated in smaller scrawls, circling the furnace in spirals. And under them letters, almost a name. Harrison. My stomach twisted. The foreman. He had been here. Maybe he never left. I traced the marks with a shaking finger, feeling the sharp grooves bite into my skin. The hum deepened, vibrating through my bones, and I realized the room was responding, alive in ways I couldn't explain. I stepped closer to the furnace itself. The heat hit me in waves, heavy and suffocating. I noticed scratches on the metal doors, tiny, almost invisible, forming symbols I couldn't interpret at first. I leaned in, squinting. The symbols pulsed faintly under the flickering light, like they had been carved with intent, with consciousness. I shivered. Every instinct told me to step back, but the compulsion to see, to understand, pulled me forward. I crouched to look at the floor. Faint footprints dusted in soot led around the furnace, small, deliberate, careful. They stopped at a grate in the corner. I knelt, brushing the dust aside. Beneath, the darkness seemed to stir, almost breathing. I felt a tug at the edge of my perception, like someone was watching me from below, waiting for me to follow. The shadows shifted again. One leaned closer, forming the shape of a man hunched over the furnace, watching, mimicking my every move. I blinked. It was gone, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing against my back, urging me to leave or maybe to step further in. The hum changed, rising to a sharp pitch, then falling back into that slow, steady thrum. The room wasn't just observing, it was speaking, in tones I couldn't yet understand. I noticed a small desk in the far corner, half buried in dust. Papers were scattered across it. I approached slowly. They were ledgers, logs, scraps of paper from decades ago. Harrison's handwriting covered them, neat at first, then frantic. They watch me, numbers speak. I cannot leave, they will not let me. The words scratched into my mind as I read them. The last page was torn, edges jagged, corners scorched. It felt like a warning, or a plea. The heat was unbearable now, pressing against me from all sides. I noticed a door at the back of the room, partially open. Beyond it, the darkness seemed deeper, almost liquid. I felt drawn, compelled, even as a part of me screamed to leave. The hum pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Shadows shifted, leaning closer, stretching toward me, mimicking movements I hadn't made yet. I realized the room wasn't just alive. It remembered every movement, every fear, every hesitation. I stepped toward the door. The floor vibrated beneath me. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I reached out, the heat burning my skin as I touched the handle. It was hot, unnaturally so, and the hum intensified, thrumming like a heartbeat in the room in me. I pulled the door open. Darkness spilled out, thick, almost solid. My reflection in the metal of the furnace flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw another face behind me, watching, waiting. I spun. Nothing. Only shadows stretching, bending, watching. A whisper drifted from the far end of the room. "Do you see?" I froze. The sound was close, intimate, and yet impossible to locate. I scanned the room, but the shadows only shifted slightly, avoiding, mimicking, teasing. I felt exposed, like the room had stripped away all pretense, leaving me raw, aware of every fear, every heartbeat. I crouched near the furnace, tracing more scratches on the metal doors. Symbols, numbers, letters, messages left by Harrison, by the workers who had disappeared. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing into me, shaping the hum, twisting the shadows. The room wasn't just remembering, it was replaying. Every motion, every fear, every last moment of the people who had vanished into its walls. I turned toward the back door again. The shadows had shifted, now forming a corridor of darkness stretching into nothing. The hum pulsed in response to my hesitation. I realized the room wanted something, not just my presence, but recognition, understanding. I took a deep breath and stepped closer. The heat pressed harder. The hum rose, a wave I could feel in my chest. The shadows swayed, leaning closer, forming figures I couldn't name, shapes half human, half memory. I reached the threshold of the darkness beyond the door. A final whisper brushed my ear. "They never leave." My pulse spiked, adrenaline surging, but curiosity pushed me forward. I had come this far. I couldn't turn back now. My flashlight cut a thin path ahead, illuminating shapes that seemed to twist in the corners of my vision. I realized the furnace room wasn't just a room. It was a recording, a memory, a trap holding echoes of those who had vanished, imprinting them into heat, metal, and shadow. I paused. The hum dropped slightly as if waiting for me to make a choice, step back or step forward. Behind me, shadows leaned, pressing closer. Ahead, darkness yawned, thick and consuming. The air tasted metallic. Sweat dripped down my face. Every instinct screamed to run, but every thought told me to move forward, to see what the room had captured, to witness what Harrison had left behind. I took a final step. The hum rose again, vibrating through my chest, through my bones. Shadows twisted, stretched, and then settled into forms almost human. The furnace room breathed around me, alive, aware, remembering. I realized then that I wasn't alone. Not truly. The echoes of everyone who had vanished were here, pressed into the walls, the heat, the shadows, replaying their last moments, shaping this place into something beyond understanding. And as I stepped further, deeper into the darkness, I knew one thing. The furnace room would never let me leave unchanged. Its whispers would follow me, its shadows would cling, and its memory would mark me like it had marked Harrison, like it had marked everyone before. I couldn't yet see the end of it, but I could feel it. A living record, waiting, always waiting, and now, in some unspoken way, aware of me. Factory doors groaned as I pushed them open, a sound like old bones snapping in protest. Outside, the night was still, thick with fog that curled around the rusted gates and overgrown weeds. I expected relief, but it didn't come. The moment I stepped onto the cracked pavement, I felt the factory's weight press against me, like a memory I couldn't shake. Every sound around me seemed amplified, twisted. The wind rustled through dead leaves, but I could swear I heard whispers. Not the wind. Voices low, urgent, fragmented. They drifted at the edge of hearing, always just out of reach. I froze, heart hammering. The world outside the factory was silent, except for the echoes in my mind. Each step I took seemed to drag the shadows from the building with me, long fingers of darkness stretching behind me, brushing against the edges of my vision. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was my imagination, that the hum of the furnace and the whispers of the shadows had imprinted themselves too deeply. But even as I walked further, the sounds persisted. Footsteps behind me, a faint creak of metal, my own breathing or someone else. I spun. Nothing. Only fog and the skeletal frame of the factory looming in the distance. Memories of the workers filled my mind unbidden. Faces I'd never seen before, etched in soot and fear, staring at me from corners of my vision. Harrison's name flashed again, etched into metal, into memory, into me. His handwriting, frantic and jagged, scrawled in a ledger I could still feel under my fingers. The furnace room had not released him. The factory kept its prisoners in a memory that stretched beyond the walls. And now, somehow, it clung to me too. A distant sound made me pause, a clang, metallic and hollow, like a hammer striking a rail. My pulse jumped. The sound came again, closer this time, echoing against the fog. I tried to rationalize it. A fallen branch, a loose gate, a trick of the wind, but I knew better. The factory's memory was alive, and it had followed me. Every sound I heard in the dark was filtered through that presence, distorted, waiting to test me. I ducked under a low pipe, brushing against rusted metal. The smell of oil and iron clung to me, carrying the faint scent of smoke from furnaces long dead. My hands were sticky with soot and sweat, my ears straining to catch any further sound. And then I heard it, the softest whisper, almost beneath the hum of my own blood. Don't forget. I stopped moving. The fog swirled around me, forming shapes that weren't there. Shadows bent and twisted in ways that felt deliberate. I felt watched, and not just by what was outside. The factory had marked me. I could feel it in the hairs on my arms, the tightness in my chest. Every memory, every echo pressed against me. I realized that leaving the factory had not freed me. It had merely transported its presence into the world around me. The road home should have been empty, silent, safe. Instead, each step carried the weight of unseen eyes. Branches scraped against the side of my jacket like skeletal fingers. Distant lights flickered in abandoned windows. My mind forced me to see figures, workers lost in shadows, hands reaching, eyes hollow and accusing. I tried to blink them away, but the images lingered, burned into my vision. I slowed, heart racing, trying to listen. Every small sound was amplified. A dog barking miles away sounded like a growl right behind me. The wind through telephone wires made a moaning that twisted into speech if I concentrated too hard. The factory's memory had tethered itself to me, and I could not escape its reach. I remembered the small office, the ledgers, the scraps of paper scattered like fallen leaves. Each note, each symbol was a fragment of someone's life consumed by the building. The factory didn't just take, they remained, trapped in metal, in rust, in shadow. And now, in some way I couldn't explain, they were with me. I felt their presence in the air, in the darkness, in every sound that whispered too clearly. A sudden movement caught my eye. A figure just beyond the fog, human, maybe, but it didn't move naturally. Its arms were too long, its posture wrong. I blinked. Gone. But the feeling lingered, a pressure on my chest, a tug at my mind. The factory had learned to follow, to project, to reach through memory into the world I thought was mine. I quickened my pace. The streetlights were few and flickering, unreliable. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and with each step I could hear faint echoes behind me, metallic clanks, the scrape of shoes on concrete, whispers in voices I didn't recognize but felt intimately familiar. The memories of those who had disappeared weren't contained within the factory walls. They were in me now, and the world around me had become a filter for their presence. I passed an abandoned lot, overgrown with weeds and broken bricks. Something moved in the corner of my eye, a flash of metal, glinting briefly like a knife or maybe a tool left behind. I stopped. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, but then I heard it, a voice low and almost comforting, though I knew it couldn't be real. Hurry! It carried urgency and fear, layered with something I didn't want to name. I turned. The lot was empty. Only fog, weeds, and the faint scent of oil lingering in the damp air. My home felt impossibly far. Every step seemed to stretch the distance, as if the factory itself were bending space, dragging me back, keeping me tethered. I kept my eyes forward, shoulders hunched, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, that my mind was playing tricks. But the whispers didn't stop. The figures didn't disappear. And in the back of my mind, I knew it was watching always, through memory and shadow. A cat hissed from the shadows and I jumped. But it wasn't the cat. The shape lingered, flickering between human and metal, body twisting impossibly. It recoiled and vanished into the fog. My chest tightened. I realized I was not imagining it. The factory had followed me, its life imprinted on memory and shadow, now twisting the world around me, bending sound, light, and perception to its will. I reached my front gate and fumbled with the lock. Every creak of metal sounded like the groan of the factory doors themselves, echoing in my chest. I finally pulled the gate open, slipping inside, but the shadows didn't stop at the threshold. Shapes twisted in the fog, pressing close, mimicking movement, whispering fragments of conversations, names, and fear. Inside, I bolted the door and pressed my back against it. Silence, mostly. But I could hear it in the walls, in the pipes, faint as a heartbeat, but there. The factory's memory pulsed with me, riding every vibration, every breath. I realized then that leaving the building had never meant leaving it behind. It had left a part of itself in me. And in that part, the lives of the lost were alive still, whispering, pressing, feeding on my fear. I moved through my apartment, but even here the echoes followed. A clatter in the kitchen sounded like a hammer striking metal. Shadows across the walls stretched long and wrong. And beneath it all, the hum, the low, steady hum, like the heartbeat of furnaces long dead. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to shut it out, but the sound was inside me now, in my blood, my bones, my memory. I tried sleep, but the factory doesn't sleep. It remembers. In the dark, I saw shapes in the corners of my vision, crouched, watching, waiting. Faint scratches, symbols, and numbers danced in the shadows across my walls. I tried to tell myself it was hallucination, exhaustion. But even as I closed my eyes, I felt the heat, the hum, the weight of the metalworks pressed against me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I could no longer tell. The whispers grew louder in the silence of night. They spoke names, dates, fragments of fear. I recognized some of them from the ledgers, from the office, from the furnace room. Harrison. Others I had never seen, but their fear was palpable, real, tethered to me. The factory had followed me home, embedding itself in the rhythm of my life, in the cadence of my mind. I thought about returning, about confronting the echoes in their own space, in the metal walls where they belonged. But the thought terrified me more than leaving. The factory had power over memory, over perception. It could replay lives, twist reality, make the ordinary feel like horror. And now, in my own apartment, it had begun to do the same. I rose to check the window. Fog clung to the glass, shaping forms, faces I didn't want to see. And then, just beyond the mist, I thought I saw a shadow hunched, watching. Human? Maybe. Metal? Perhaps. I couldn't tell. It blinked, and the memory of the furnace room flashed through me. The heat, the hum, the shadows mimicking me. The factory was alive in me, around me, rewriting the world in its image. I sank to the floor, trying to focus on anything else. The hum, the shadows, the whispers. They were all intertwined now, part of me and part of something older, deeper. The lives left in metal had not disappeared. They lingered, etched into memory, into heat, into shadow. And I was now a vessel, a witness, carrying their echoes through the world. And as dawn crept, weak and gray, across the horizon, I realized something that made my stomach turn. Leaving the factory had not ended it. It had only begun to reach beyond. Every sound, every shadow, every faint movement in the corner of my eye was filtered through its memory. I had carried it out with me, and it would not let me forget, not ever. The question that haunted me as I stared at the fatting fog was simple, but unbearable. If the factory's life could stretch beyond its walls, how far would it go? And more importantly, what would it want from me next? The door gave way with a sound like old bones snapping. A gust of cold air hit me, carrying the faint, sour tang of decayed grain and rusted metal. I stepped inside, boots echoing on cracked tiles, and for a moment the world outside disappeared. Only the hall remained, stretching wide and empty, a cavern of shadows and whispers. Conveyor belts hung like skeletons, their joints creaking softly in the wind. Each groan seemed deliberate, a slow, mocking rhythm that set my nerves on edge. I should have felt relief that no one was here, that the place was abandoned. Instead, the silence pressed against me, heavy and expectant. Something in the way the belts swayed made it feel like they were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I moved forward cautiously, each step careful. Dust rose from the floor, catching in the beams of weak light filtering through broken windows. Patterns of grime created faces in the corners of my vision, smiling, angry, desperate. I blinked and they vanished. But the feeling remained that the building remembered people who were gone, that it carried their essence in the metal and oil stains. A sudden clang echoed from the far end of the hall. My heart jumped. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a presence, like a warning. I froze, straining to hear more, but only the belts creaked and the wind whispered through broken pipes. I told myself it was a falling piece of metal, a branch striking the roof. But part of me knew it wasn't so simple. The floor was littered with scraps of paper, old packaging, and shards of glass. I knelt to examine one, a faded production sheet, yellowed and brittle. The names of workers were printed in neat columns, some crossed out in heavy ink. The sight made my stomach twist. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was intruding on lives that had left something behind, something the plant didn't want disturbed. As I stood, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows shifting along the walls, elongating unnaturally. I spun. Nothing. The hall was empty, but the feeling persisted, crawling up my spine, that I was being mirrored, that someone or something was packing in tandem with me. The belts creaked again, and the sound took on a rhythm that was almost human. I followed the belts deeper into the hall, past rusting machinery and stacks of crates. The air grew heavier, sticky with the lingering smell of oil and something metallic, coppery and faintly sweet. I realized it reminded me of blood, though I hadn't seen any. My pulse quickened. Every sense screamed at me that this place had its own life, its own memory, and it was paying attention. A narrow doorway led off to a side room. I hesitated, hand on the handle. The room beyond was darker, colder, and smelled of mold and decay. Inside, I could see remnants of old food containers, crates toppled and broken, and a faint stain on the floor that glinted in the weak light. I crouched, heart hammering. It looked like something had spilled years ago, left to harden into a dark, almost black pattern. Something about it felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The belts creaked louder, closer. I froze, scanning the room. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and heavy. I could feel them pressing at the edges of my vision as if trying to draw me into their rhythm. The wind picked up, whistling through broken vents, and I could swear it carried voices, fragmented, low, urgent. I could catch pieces, a name, a warning, a question. But before I could make sense of them, the sound faded, leaving me alone with the rhythm of the belts. I moved toward the main hall again, compelled by a curiosity I couldn't resist. Each step echoed in the emptiness, bouncing off walls covered in peeling paint and rust. Faint scratches marred the metal frames of machinery, small but deliberate, like tally marks left by someone counting days, or something else. I tried to imagine who might have done it, why, and my mind kept circling back to the names on the old production sheet. The farther I went, the colder it became. My breath fogged in the dim light. The belts swayed slightly, though no wind came from anywhere near them. A shadow shifted across the floor, breaking the line of light from a cracked window. I stopped, my chest tight. The shape didn't belong to me, and it didn't belong to any natural source of light. It seemed almost human, but wrong. I blinked, and it vanished. I pressed on, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. The hall stretched endlessly, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks, compressing and expanding the space around me. I began to notice patterns in the grime, shapes that repeated in irregular intervals. Faces, hands, abstract symbols, etched or formed naturally by decay, I couldn't tell. Something in me recognized them, though I didn't want to admit it. They belonged to people I'd never met, yet I felt their eyes on me. The belts groaned again, louder this time, as if in warning. I could feel a vibration in the floor beneath my boots, subtle but insistent. My hands pressed against a support beam, trying to steady myself. The air was thick, almost breathing with me, expanding and contracting. I realized that the factory's emptiness was a presence, alive in memory and shadow, reaching out through sound and movement. I explored a corner of the hall where crates had fallen in a heap. Something glittered in the dust, a tool abandoned and rusted but oddly intact. I picked it up. It felt cold, heavier than its size suggested. Holding it, I had a brief sense of relief, a momentary anchor in the surreal tension of the hall. But then I heard it, the belts, groaning in a cadence that mirrored my heartbeat. The comfort slipped away. I stepped further, noticing a faint stain along the conveyor rails, dark and smeared like oil mixed with something darker. My stomach churned. I knelt to inspect it. The smell rose again, iron and something almost sweet, and I gagged. The belts moved slightly as if nudged by a phantom hand. I swore I could feel a presence behind me, just beyond the fog of my perception, watching me struggle with fear I didn't fully understand. A sudden rush of wind swept through the hall, scattering dust and loose papers. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows, fleeting glimpses of figures bending and stretching. I blinked. Gone. But the instinct stayed. Whatever had been there, it had left an impression, a memory stamped into the space. The factory had a way of keeping its dead clothes in motion, in whisper, in reflection. I turned to leave, realizing I had spent more time than I thought wandering in the hall. But the exit looked farther than before, distorted by fog and darkness. Every step I took echoed, met by a counterstep I couldn't see. I wasn't alone. The hall had mirrored me, or maybe it had been following. The sound of the belts now felt like a pulse in my skull, reminding me of every life that had passed through this empty place. As I finally approached the doorway, the wind settled. Silence returned, almost comforting, but beneath it I could still hear the faintest trace of groaning metal, a rhythm that would not leave me. Outside, the night had thickened, fog hugging the perimeter of the building. I pushed open the door and stepped out, gasping, heart pounding. And yet, even in the open air, the factory followed. I could hear the echo of the belts, faint and insistent, the memory of movement and metal pressing against me. Every shadow, every fragment of wind seemed to carry its rhythm. The emptiness had left a mark on me, a pulse I could not ignore. I looked back once. The hall was dark, quiet, but I knew better. It would remember me. It would wait. And I knew, even as I walked away into the foggy night, that I had only glimpsed the surface of its memory. The door groaned shut behind me and the smell hit first. Stale food, oil, and something sour that made my stomach twist. I hadn't expected the factory to smell like this, even after years of abandonment. The air was thick, clinging to my skin like a damp coat. Every step I took echoed off the walls, metal on tile, a rhythm that felt deliberate. I ducked under a low conveyor frame, noticing the first signs of life or memory. Lunch boxes, corroded and dented, lay tucked between machinery. Some were cracked open, revealing layers of dust and grime, the shapes of old sandwiches frozen in decay. I lifted one gingerly. Inside, a note, yellowed and brittle, caught my eye. "Don't trust him," it said in shaky handwriting. No name, no date, just a warning. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it. A note like that shouldn't exist here, not among rusted gears and conveyor belts. I scanned the room, half expecting a shadow to materialize in the corner, someone watching me with eyes that had never truly closed. The belts creaked softly, like a heartbeat I could feel but not locate. I found another lunch box, wedged behind a stack of crates. Its note was longer, complaints, rumors, grudges. A worker had written about a foreman who pushed people too hard, who singled out those who asked questions. I felt the unease creep into my chest. These weren't just notes, they were confessions, a map of fear left behind. I could almost hear the echoes of whispered arguments in the corners of the hall. Dust floated in the weak sunlight filtering through broken windows. As I moved between machines, I noticed the floor littered with scraps of paper, more letters, crumpled but intact. Some were personal, mentioning wives and children. Others hinted at tensions, rivalries, threats unspoken aloud. I picked up one, its edges charred, words smudged. "If anything happens to me, watch the furnace." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what it meant, but the urgency behind it pressed on my chest. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes following me through the maze of machines. The factory had a memory, and it didn't like intruders. The belts swayed slightly, though there was no wind. Shadows pooled beneath them, stretching like fingers across the floor. I took a step back. My foot kicked something, a tin cup dented and empty. I glanced around. The room was still, yet the hum of metal seemed alive. A low vibration ran through the floor, subtle but insistent, like the memory of footsteps long gone. I moved toward a small alcove between two conveyor lines. More lunch boxes, more notes. Each letter painted a picture of life inside this plant. Exhaustion, resentment, the fear of disappearing without explanation. Some notes hinted at arguments that had escalated into threats. Others spoke of strange occurrences, shadows moving at night, whispers behind closed doors. My pulse quickened. Was it paranoia, or had someone or something been watching them? A faint smell of burnt sugar drifted from the corner. I followed it and found a stack of metal trays, still warm to the touch despite the years. I dropped my hand, startled. The warmth was impossible. My rational mind raced for explanations. Solar heat, insulation, but the factory was dead. And yet, for a heartbeat, it had felt alive. I pressed onward, collecting letters carefully, reading snippets as I went. Rivalries over shifts, threats made in anger, confessions scribbled in fear. It all added up to a network of tension, of lives fraying under pressure. And then I noticed it, a name repeated across several notes: Dempsey, foreman, the one everyone had feared, the one who vanished. The belts groaned again, almost in reply. My stomach clenched. I had thought the factory silent, lifeless. but it responded, subtle teasing, warning me that curiosity had a cost. I glanced over my shoulder. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes almost human. I shook my head, telling myself it was the light, the dust, my imagination. But the feeling persisted, eyes watching from somewhere unseen. I crouched beside a conveyor leg, sifting through more letters. One described a confrontation, words exchanged in whispers, threats made in ink. Another warned of machines that seemed to operate on their own, moving items just out of reach, obstructing paths. My fingers trembled as I realized the letters weren't just memories. They were guides, maps of survival in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. A sudden clatter echoed from the far end of the hall. My head snapped toward the sound, muscles tensing. Nothing visible, just a shadow shifting, elongated and unnatural. My chest tightened. The letters in my hand rustled, though no breeze moved them. The factory was alive in memory, in metal, in the spaces between sound and silence. I pressed onward, moving past a row of machines lined with rusted tools. Another lunch box sat wedged in a gap. Inside was a folded note. "Keep your head down, don't follow the sounds." The handwriting was sharp, hurried. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I could feel it. The tension of someone who had lived here, who had feared what the building could do, what it could remember. I almost set the box down, but curiosity pulled me closer, deeper into the hall. I found a small office tucked into a corner, its door barely hanging on hinges. Inside, more remnants. A coat draped over a chair, a worn notebook, coffee mug still faintly stained. I picked up the notebook. The entries were dated, detailed, intimate. Names, grievances, the small humiliations that built into larger fears. And then at the end, a line scratched in desperation. "They're watching, always watching." The room seemed to inhale. Shadows clung to corners like thick smoke. The belts hummed in the hall outside, a slow cadence, almost a warning. I could feel the factory pressing against my senses, bending perception. Even the light seemed wrong, sharper, colder, pointing toward things I couldn't see. I backed out of the office slowly, glancing at the floor. A trail of rust and grime hinted at movement, someone dragged through here recently. My mind raced. Nothing should be moving. And yet, the letters, the warnings, the strange warmth from trays long cold, it all suggested life, or at least memory that acted like life. I paused mid-step. The hum of the belts shifted, rising in pitch, almost speaking. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision. Faces pressed against the grime on windows, fleeting glimpses, gone when I looked directly. I realized then that the factory didn't just hold memories. It repeated them, displayed them, trapped them for anyone foolish enough to enter. I forced myself to move. The notes and letters weighed on me, evidence of lives enmeshed with this metal and dust. Rivalries, fears, betrayals, all locked in a silent, echoing rhythm. I felt the weight of each one, as though the workers' anxieties had saturated the very walls. Every step I took was on the memories of someone else's terror, someone else's small rebellions and failures. A metallic clink echoed behind me. I spun, nothing, but the letters in my hands trembled, rustling as if blown by an unseen wind. My pulse raced. I pressed them to my chest, moving toward the main hall, toward the exit. The shadows stretched along the floor, writhing, elongating with the dimming light. I realized the factory was far from empty. Its past was here, alive in the ways I could barely comprehend. I paused by the last row of conveyors, glancing back. Lunch boxes, letters, trays, all remnants of lives left behind, moments frozen in fear and defiance. The belts groaned in the darkness, a soft, deliberate rhythm. I knew I should leave, should escape before the memories pressed closer, became weight unbearable. And yet I was drawn to them, to the stories embedded in rust and dust. As I stepped toward the exit, a folded note slipped from between two conveyors. I caught it. Only a few words. "Don't forget, they remember." I swallowed, heart hammering. The hall seemed to breathe, the shadows stretching toward me, almost pleading, almost warning. I left, stepping into the night, the letters clutched to my chest. Outside, the wind carried a faint metallic tang, a reminder that what I had touched inside would not let me forget. Even now, walking away, I could feel it. The rhythm of belts echoing in memory, the weight of fears long past pressing on me. I had discovered fragments of lives that no one should have left behind, and the factory had let me see but not fully understand. Somewhere in the shadows, in the echoes, in the hum of metal, the workers waited, watching, remembering, and perhaps warning me that curiosity has its cost. And I knew I would return. The exit door groaned as I pushed it open, expecting fresh air, quiet freedom. But the hall beyond didn't feel empty. It was wrong. The air thick, heavy, like I'd walked into yesterday instead of today. A faint hum lingered, not mechanical, not entirely natural. Something was replaying and I was inside it. I stepped onto the floor and the shadows seemed to stretch differently. Conveyor belts that had been still yesterday now creaked softly, swinging as if recently used. The smell of oil, sweat, and burnt sugar curled in my nose, familiar and oppressive. I froze, realizing the factory wasn't just a building. It was memory, a memory that refused to rest. Ahead, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure darted behind a machine, blurred, indistinct. My mind scrambled, someone left behind, or a trick of the light. The belts shifted under my feet, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was still working, following an invisible schedule. I found a lunchbox lying on the floor, not where I remembered it. Inside, a note, crisp and unweathered. "Do not leave. Do not let them see." My pulse jumped. This handwriting was different from the others. Recent, alive, but how? The factory had been abandoned for years. I gripped the lunchbox, the metal cold and smooth in my hands, but the words burned in my mind. I couldn't look away. A low clang echoed from the far end of the hall. Not random, patterned, deliberate. I felt a chill creep up my spine, the familiar rhythm of machinery now laced with intent. Something had been trapped here, and the factory was replaying its last hours like a film I was forced to watch. I moved toward the sound, my footsteps tentative on the grimy floor. Machines that had rusted and decayed now seemed poised for motion, their gears whispering secrets I couldn't yet understand. Shadows stretched across the walls, forming shapes too human to dismiss. I could see hands raised in fear, a back pressed against steel, a head ducked under conveyor belts. Memories of lives abruptly cut off, and I was walking among them. I found a locker, doors hanging open. Inside, jackets, hats, and notebooks lay scattered untouched. A notebook caught my eye. Its pages were filled with scrawled entries, frantic at first, then gradually slipping into illegibility. Names, times, odd warnings. "They are coming back. Don't turn around. Keep the line moving." I read the words aloud in a whisper, my voice trembling. The factory seemed to sigh in response, a draft of air carrying the faint scent of coffee and sweat. I stepped back, nearly dropping the notebook. The belts shifted again, faster this time, a mimicry of urgency. A flash of movement, someone crossing the floor, but no one there. Just the hum of metal, the shadows folding into themselves. My chest tightened. It wasn't empty. Someone or something had been trapped in here when the factory shut down. The final day had never ended, and now it was replaying for me. I followed a row of machines, each one seemingly alive with the echo of its last operator. The sound of metal hitting metal, tools dropped in panic, whispered fragments of conversation. Rivalries, arguments, last-minute mistakes. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, thick enough to choke on. One letter on the floor read, "If we leave now, they'll take him." Him, the foreman, a worker. I didn't know. The line between memory and reality blurred. I reached for a conveyor lever. It moved under my hand as though pushed by someone unseen, smooth and deliberate. My mind tried to rationalize. Rusted metal doesn't move. Not alone. Not like this. I pressed onward. Shadows on the walls began to move independently of the light. Faces appeared, then vanished. Hands clawed at thin air. I could feel a presence breathing behind me, brushing my shoulder, though when I turned, nothing was there. The notes, the lunchboxes, the scattered belongings, they weren't just reminders. They were warnings, markers of a day that refused to end. I stopped by the main control panel. Switches flickered in dim light, though I hadn't touched them. A screen, black for years, showed a scene, the factory alive. Machines humming, workers moving quickly, arguing softly. The foreman barking instructions. And then a shadow detached from the wall, following a worker to the furnace room. I blinked. My stomach lurched. That shadow had no owner. I looked around. Everything was still, silent now, but the image burned behind my eyes. The shift had never ended. Everyone who had worked that day, some were gone, some vanished. And the factory played it again and again until someone like me came close enough to witness it. A chair scraped behind me. I whirled, empty. The echo lingered, a memory pressed into the walls. My hands shook. The belts moved again, a slow cadence, imitating the rhythm of hurried footsteps. I tried to step back, but the floor seemed to extend, elongating the distance between exit and safety. The factory had me. I picked up another letter, half-burned, edges blackened. The words were stark. They never left, and now neither will you. I swallowed, heart hammering. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. Abandoned factories don't trap people, but the shadows said otherwise. The air thickened with the weight of unclaimed presence. I could feel eyes in every corner, following, judging, waiting. I stumbled across a fallen tool, a wrench, slick with something that shouldn't exist after all these years. I held it, trying to convince myself it was rust. But the smell, coppery and iron strong, pressed in. The belts hummed louder, vibrating through the floor. I realized then that the factory wasn't just replaying its last day. It was rehearsing it for me, looping the final moments over and over until someone understood. A flicker of movement on a distant conveyor, a hand reaching out. I froze. It vanished before I could approach. My throat dry, I realized. The workers who disappeared, the foreman who vanished, the arguments, the hurried notes, they were all trapped in metal and memory. The building kept them, replaying their fear, their mistakes, their last choices. I moved cautiously toward the exit, glancing back constantly. Shadows folded, twisted, but never fully revealed themselves. The factory seemed alive, responsive. Every step I took was mirrored by a flicker on the wall, a whisper in the hum, a cold draft brushing my neck. The past was near, tangible, insisting I see it. A tray clattered to the ground behind me. I jumped, nearly dropping the letters I had collected. But when I turned, nothing had fallen naturally. The factory was manipulating the world around me, bending physics with memory. I could almost hear the whispers of the workers, arguments about shifts, threats made in desperation, apologies never spoken. They were everywhere and nowhere. I reached the main hall, the exit in sight. But the belts now moved differently, faster, jerking items as if replaying panic. Shadows condensed at the edges of my vision, human-shaped, pressing closer with each step. I could feel the fear embedded in the walls. I could taste it, iron on my tongue, thick in the air. A note fluttered from above, landing at my feet. I bent to pick it up. Only a few words. Follow them or be left behind. I looked up. The shadow from the control panel, larger now, slipped along the wall, mimicking movement I had yet to take. My stomach twisted. The shift had never ended. I was witnessing it, participating in it, trapped in its rhythm. I ran. The belts rattled, the machines groaned, the shadows followed. Memories pressed in from all sides. I could hear arguments, warnings, last words of workers never meant to survive. Each step pulled me deeper, the exit stretching farther, more distant. Then silence, brief, almost comforting. I gasped, chest heaving. But the hum returned, softer, insidious. Shapes moved just beyond sight, and I knew the shift hadn't finished. The factory was patient. It waited for me to understand, to acknowledge the lives it had consumed, the moments it preserved in metal and fear. I stumbled into the night outside, letters clutched tightly, sweat and dust coating my skin. The cool air burned after the suffocating memory. I thought I had escaped. But the images, the shadows, the rhythm of that endless shift, they followed me. The factory had imprinted itself on my mind. Even now, in the silence of my apartment, I hear it. The soft hum of belts, the distant clatter of metal, whispers of workers trapped in a day that never ended. I close my eyes and see shadows pressing against the walls, hands reaching, faces half glimpsed. The shift is still going. Somewhere inside that building, the memory waits, patient, unrelenting. And I know I'll have to return. I stepped into the boiler room and the air hit me first. Thick, heavy, smelling of rust and wet paper. Steam curled from every pipe, wrapping around the shadows and making them twitch like living things. I stopped, trying to steady my breath, but it came fast and shallow. The room didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching. The metal walkways glistened under the dim yellow light, slick with condensation. Every step I took echoed, bouncing off the brick walls in odd rhythms. The sound didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too measured, like the room itself had a heartbeat. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision. I swore one leaned closer, then straightened when I blinked. A pipe hissed overhead. Steam blasted out, momentarily blinding me, and when it cleared, I thought I saw a figure pressed against the far wall, just for a second. Then nothing. The shadows were still twitching, but the space was empty. Or was it? I ran my hand along a railing. It was warm, almost alive beneath my fingers. My mind tried to rationalize it, heat from the boiler, but the warmth moved, sliding along the metal like a pulse. Something was here, moving inside the steam between the pipes, and I could feel it without seeing it. I found a small maintenance door, half open, steam curling out in ghostly tendrils. I peered inside. Shadows pooled in the corners, dark and dense, and for a moment I thought I could make out eyes, two tiny pinpoints staring back at me. I pulled back too quickly, my chest tight. The shadows shifted again, rearranging themselves into shapes that mimicked human posture. Arms, bent elbows, backs hunched. Watching. Waiting. A faint clatter echoed from the far end of the room. My ears strained. Metal against metal. Could have been a loose valve or a tool falling. But it wasn't random. It had a rhythm, deliberate, repeating. I swallowed hard. The steam thinned in one corner, revealing the shape of a boiler, blackened and scarred. I saw footprints on the wet floor, small, narrow, then disappearing as if someone had lifted their feet mid-step. I followed them, step by careful step. Each footprint seemed older than the last, yet fresher than the air around me. The steam swirled thick, curling around my legs, and I felt it brush my skin, cold and insistent. Something wanted me to follow, to see. My stomach twisted with fear, but my curiosity pressed me forward. A valve hissed to life on its own. Steam burst upward, blinding me again. I stumbled back, gripping the railing. When I could see, the shadows had moved. They formed a corridor leading deeper into the room, black and empty, but alive. I could hear whispers in the hiss of the pipes, words that didn't make sense but felt urgent, like warnings I couldn't understand. I stepped closer, the metal floor vibrating beneath my boots. My shadow stretched long and thin across the wet tiles, bending as though the light itself was alive. Another hiss, closer this time, and the shadows shivered. I froze. A hand-like shape reached out, hovering just above the floor, but when I blinked it was gone. I found a small box of old tools near the boilers. Rusted, abandoned, but arranged neatly. A wrench rested on top, clean, polished, out of place. I picked it up, and a jolt ran through me like the metal itself remembered who I was. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in, pushing memories into me. Workers long gone, the boiler roaring, the steam rising. A single note tucked under the wrench read, "Don't look back." I froze, gripping the wrench tighter. Who wrote that? The room didn't belong to me, yet somehow it did. The steam thickened, forming shapes in the air. Faces, just glimpses. A man with soot-blackened cheeks, eyes wide. A woman's mouth opening in a scream that never left a sound. I stumbled backward, hitting a pipe. Steam hissed over my shoulder like a snake, curling around my neck. A low groan reverberated through the room. The boilers trembled, metal singing. I thought I saw a shadow peel away from the wall, moving across the floor toward me. I flinched, but it stopped, hovering, waiting. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted. The steam carried voices now clearer. Words broken, overlapping. Stay, don't leave, don't see. I turned toward the exit. It seemed farther than it should be, the shadows lengthening to block the path. My chest burned, heart hammering. Then I noticed a flicker of movement at the far end, steam lifting just enough to reveal a ladder leading up. Relief, but fleeting. Something moved beneath the ladder, quick and dark. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was watching. I climbed, metal rungs slick with condensation. Each step groaned. My shadow stretched against the walls, joining the twisting shapes of the steam. I reached the top, and for a moment the room seemed to pause. Hisses and groans softened. The shadows froze mid-movement. Silence, thick and expectant. Then a single clatter. A wrench from below rolled across the floor. I saw it spin once, then stop. And in that pause I understood. The room remembered. It remembered everything. Every worker who had slipped, every valve that had exploded, every scream that had been swallowed by the boilers. The steam wasn't just air and water. It was memory, living memory. I reached the doorway to the catwalk above. Light spilled in from the stairwell. Safe, perhaps, but the steam lingered, curling up after me, whispering in half-formed words I couldn't escape. Faces flashed in it. Eyes, mouths, hands, waiting for recognition, waiting for me to see. I stepped onto the upper walkway. The shadows thin, stretching toward me like fingers. One followed me, lingering on the edge of the light, and I knew it wasn't finished. I clutched the wrench, heartbeat loud in my ears, every sense screaming. The factory below breathed with a life of its own, watching, remembering, waiting. A door opened on the far end. Freedom, I thought. But the steam surged again, curling around my boots, forcing me to pause. The shadows swayed, forming shapes I almost recognized. Colleagues, friends, people who had vanished here long ago. Their mouths moved silently, pleading. The memory of the factory was alive, and I was inside it. I moved forward slowly. Each step was mirrored by a shadow, as though the room wanted to walk with me, guide me, trap me in the rhythm of its breathing. The hiss of the pipes became voices. The groan of the boilers became footsteps, and I realized I was no longer alone, not ever. I reached the stairwell. Cold air from outside brushed my face, a reminder of the world beyond. Relief, brief and shallow. But as I glanced back, the shadows at the edges of the steam shifted, forming a shape that lingered at the base of the ladders. Eyes, watching, patient. And I knew the boiler room would wait for me always until I returned. I stepped into the next hall, and the air changed. Colder now, damp, smelling of old metal and paper dust. Faded photographs lined the walls, their edges curling like dying leaves. Faces stared back at me, grim, expressionless, some smiling faintly, some glaring as if I had walked into their secrets. I felt the weight of eyes I didn't know, pressed against my chest. The pipes overhead groaned softly, almost a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but then words began to form, muffled and indistinct. Murmurs, voices folded into the hiss of the steam. I froze, straining to hear. The words slipped past comprehension, but the tone carried fear. Not my fear, someone else. Someone trapped in the metal and steam around me. I ran my fingers along the photographs. One fell loose, dangling by a single rusted nail. A man in his 40s, coal-smudged face, eyes hollow. He held a wrench, but it looked like it weighed more than him. Beneath the photo, a name scratched into the wall, Harold. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know why, but I remembered him. Or at least I remembered his face, though I had never seen it before. The murmurs grew louder, layered. Conversations overlapping, whispers blending into cries and laughter. I felt them circling me, rising through the pipes, climbing the walls. I wanted to turn back to escape, but the hall stretched farther than it should have. Shadows pooled at the edges, shifting subtly, hinting at forms I couldn't see fully. A conveyor belt lay idle along one side, rusted and frozen in time. Lunch boxes sat on it, toppled, dusted with years of neglect. I opened one. Inside, wrapped in tattered cloth, was a note. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. They watch, always, don't trust the shadows. I dropped the note as if it burned my fingers. The murmurs shifted, softer now, teasing me, repeating one word over and over. Watch, I looked up. Pipes above twisted in strange angles, forming shapes that almost resembled faces. Steam hissed between them like speech. The walls seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding, carrying echoes of 1,000 days that had ended here, never forgot. I took a step forward. A shadow moved across the floor, separate from the light, separate from me. It mirrored my movements for a moment, then darted ahead, vanishing behind a stack of crates. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to call out, but the sound would have felt wrong here, intrusive. I was intruding on something far older than myself. The photos on the wall seemed to change. One moment the man with the wrench looked tired. The next his eyes were wide, terrified, mouth open as if mid-scream. Another flickered, lips moving silently, forming words I could not hear. I stepped closer, but the image blurred, dissolving into the texture of the wall. My hands hovered over the plaster. Cold, unyielding, yet strangely soft, as though the wall itself had a pulse. A faint scuttling echoed behind me. I turned sharply. Nothing. The hall was empty, or at least I thought it was. The murmurs rose again, urgent now. Don't leave, don't leave, don't leave, I froze. The repetition had rhythm. Someone or something was trying to communicate, to warn, or perhaps to trap me. A lunch box tumbled off the conveyor belt, clattering to the floor. My eyes snapped to it. Inside, a photograph. A group of workers, grim and silent. The edges of the photo seemed darker than the rest, as if the shadows had seeped into it. I stared, and for a heartbeat the workers' heads turned, eyes following me. I blinked. They were still. I looked again. One had moved. Not fully, just a tilt of the head, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. The pipes groaned louder. Steam hissed, wrapping around my ankles. I could feel shapes brushing past, cold and damp, brushing at my skin, but when I spun, there was nothing there. The hall seemed to stretch longer, darker, the end vanishing in mist and shadow. I wanted to run, but something held me. Curiosity, fear, the pull of the voices. I moved forward slowly. The murmurs became voices again, forming broken sentences. He knows, he took the wrench, can't stop, can't leave. I froze, took the wrench. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, though it was empty. Was the room replaying something, or warning me? The shadows leaned closer, stretching toward me. Shapes of bodies, limbs bent unnaturally, pressed close but just out of reach. The murmurs twisted into laughter, faint, cruel, layered over gasps and sobs. I stumbled over a crate. Inside were letters, yellowed and brittle. I picked one up. It was addressed to no one, signed only with initials, J.S. They work in silence, they do not speak, and when the machines stop, we are left behind. My stomach churned. The letters were warnings, memories, perhaps confessions. I felt the weight of all who had worked here pressing down, their lives etched into metal, into walls, into the air itself. The pipes seemed to respond to my realization. Steam hissed, whispering a slow chant, voices overlapping. Left behind, left behind, left behind. A photograph fell from the wall, fluttering down. It showed a group of workers in a circle, faces hidden in shadow. Their hands rested on one another's shoulders. I stared at it too long. Their eyes shifted, mouths opened. I could hear faint breathing, shallow and quick, rising from the paper itself. I backed away. My boots slid across the wet floor. Steam wrapped around me, pressing my hair to my forehead. The hall seemed alive, watching, breathing, waiting. Each photograph, each note, each shadow was part of it, feeding it, growing it. I understood then, the factory remembered. Every fear, every rivalry, every unspoken threat, all of it lingered here, waiting. A door loomed ahead. I thought it was my way out, my escape, but the shadows in front of it were thicker. Faces, twisted and elongated in the steam, reached toward me. They whispered warnings, soft and urgent. Do not leave, do not see, do not touch. I hesitated. The murmurs layered on themselves, forming a cacophony that pressed into my mind. And then a sudden quiet. Just for a second, I looked down. The letters and photographs were gone, the hall empty, but the air was heavier, warmer, almost alive. I realized the room had not stopped with me. It continued even when I couldn't see, waiting for the next hand, the next footstep. I moved toward the door slowly, each step mirrored by a shadow that lingered, following me. My hand rested on the handle, cold metal, familiar. I turned back once. Faces pressed against the walls, watching silently now. Eyes locked on me, but mouths still, waiting, patient. And I knew the moment I stepped through, the factory would remember me too. I twisted the handle. The door groaned open. Steam poured out, carrying voices, faces, whispers. I stepped through. A hallway beyond. Safer, I thought. But the shadows lingered at the edge of my vision. The murmurs followed. Every step echoed with the memories of those trapped, those who had vanished, those who had lived in silence. I paused just beyond the threshold. My heart slowed, then sped again. I could hear the factory breathing behind me, alive with recollection, remembering my presence, weaving me into its story. And though I had escaped this hall, the echoes of the past would follow me, twisting every sound, every shadow, every whisper of wind into its memory. The room smelled of old paper, mildew, and something metallic that clung to my clothes. I found it tucked beneath a pile of broken machinery, a ledger, leather-bound and swollen with age. The cover was scratched, worn, almost pleading to remain hidden. I hesitated, fingers brushing against the surface, and I could feel the weight of all the secrets it carried. I opened it. The first pages were neat, methodical names, dates, numbers, payroll logs, entries for men and women who had once walked these halls. But as I flipped further, the writing grew erratic. Numbers crossed out, overwritten, margins scrawled with warnings. Check him. Don't trust her. Keep quiet. My stomach turned. I had expected bookkeeping, but this was something else entirely. One name stood out. Repeated, underlined, circled, Thomas Keene, beside it a date, and a note simple, chilling, gone, no one saw, don't ask. I swallowed hard. The ledger wasn't just keeping numbers, it was keeping memory, or perhaps it was keeping the dead. I could hear it before I saw it, a whisper almost beneath the hum of the building, pipes groaning, metal shifting, the soft rustle of paper. But this time it sounded like someone leaning over my shoulder, whispering just for me. I froze. My eyes darted across the pages. More notes, more names, more veiled threats. If you tell, it will be your turn. The shadows in the corners seemed to twitch with each word I read. A fan overhead creaked and rattled, casting moving shapes across the walls. For a moment I thought I saw a man standing there. No face, just the silhouette. Then he vanished. My pulse spiked, chest tight, but I couldn't look away. The ledger detailed discrepancies in wages, bribes, threats that had been made between workers and supervisors. The handwriting in the margins was frantic, uneven. Someone had been terrified. Reading it, I could feel the fear that had pooled in this factory, like condensation on the cold metal walls. It was still here, thick, almost visible, almost alive. One entry made me freeze, a name I didn't recognize. Beside it, found in the boiler room, head missing, no witnesses. I pressed my hand to the page. The letters trembled under my fingers. I wanted to close it, throw it away, run. But I couldn't. Something pulled me deeper, made me read on, page after page. The murmurs rose again. Not just whispers now, but layers, snatches of conversation from decades ago. Arguments, accusations, apologies that came too late. I could hear them all overlapping, the voices trapped in the walls and pipes, like the ledger had captured them along with their secrets. I reached another page, and there it was, a note I couldn't ignore, written in a hand that wasn't the neat script of the payroll, but something jagged, urgent. He watches the numbers. He remembers who is missing. We are next if we do not pay. I looked up, heart pounding. The room felt smaller. The corners pressed closer. Steam hissed faintly, brushing across my neck. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a shadow move against the far wall, a figure crouching just out of the corner of my eye. When I blinked, it was gone, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. I tried to make sense of the ledger. Patterns emerged. Missing wages tied to certain shifts, threats linked to late nights, and always one name recurring, almost like a signature in the margins. SK, I didn't know who SK was, but I felt it before I read it. Presence, tension, a promise of something unresolved. I heard it then, a soft scraping from the floor above. Not loud, not mechanical, like fingernails across concrete. I froze, listening, footsteps maybe, or something lighter, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was rats. Old buildings make noise, but the scraping moved with purpose, circling the room, sometimes closer, sometimes fatting. I returned to the ledger. The pages detailed a confrontation. Names crossed out in red ink, arguments broken by threats, and finally, a page soaked with black stains. I could feel the dread through the paper. One line jumped at me. He won't stop until all are silent. One remains. I swallowed, mouth dry. The pipes groaned, almost impatiently. Shadows stretched across the walls, forming shapes that seemed to crouch and lean. I tried to steady my breathing, but each inhale felt loud, invasive. Each exhale stirred the air, the steam, the tension. I flipped another page, payroll numbers, threats, and then sketches, drawings of the factory floor, paths marked with arrows. One in particular, crude but clear, circled the boiler room, the same place where a head had been found. Lines connected other rooms, other people, some crossed out. The ledger was more than a book. It was a map of terror. I set the ledger down. My hands shook. Something moved in the shadows again. Not fast, not loud, just enough to let me know I wasn't alone. I realized then the ledger didn't just record history, it called attention to it. And attention was dangerous. A muffled voice whispered behind me. "Do you see?" I spun. Nothing. Only shadows flickering against the walls, twisted and tall. I backed up, stumbled over a chair, and the scraping stopped. Silence, dense and heavy, filled the room. My pulse slowed just for a second. Relief, brief and fragile. I returned to the ledger. Another page, a ledger within a ledger. Notes on threats, amounts owed, warnings scribbled in the margins. One name appeared over and over. The one unresolved murder, Thomas Keene, linked to SK. The more I read, the more I felt a presence pressing down, closer, almost brushing against my shoulder, urging me forward. I realized then the factory didn't just hold memories, it held judgment. Every threat, every missing person, every blackened margin, it was all alive, watching, waiting. The ledger was a key, a map, and a warning. I didn't understand who would be next, or if the warnings were for the living or for me. But I could feel the tension coiling tighter, ready to spring. Pages fell open to the last entry. Bloodstains, smudges, a warning written in frantic hand. Do not look, do not follow, they never leave. One day someone will read and it will be too late. The words burned themselves into my mind. The shadows thickened. The murmurs rose into whispers, screams, laughter, a cacophony that pressed against my ears. My skin prickled. Every photograph on the walls, every pipe overhead, every scrap of paper seemed to lean toward me, insisting that I see, that I understand, that I remember. And then I noticed it, a figure at the edge of the hall, not fully formed, just a shape, watching. I could feel its gaze on me, steady, patient. A hand, pale and elongated, rested on a rusted railing. It didn't move, but the air around it trembled. The ledger trembled in my hands as well, almost as if it recognized the presence, as if it were alive itself. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the ledger. The whispers shifted, urgent now, chaotic. You shouldn't have come, you shouldn't have read, now it's your turn. I tried to run, but the hall seemed longer than before. Shadows twisted, forming hallways that hadn't existed moments ago. The factory was rewriting itself, responding to me, the ledger, the knowledge I had uncovered. I gripped the book tightly and pressed it to my chest. The murmurs softened, almost curious now, inspecting me, weighing me. I understood then the ledger wasn't done. It would continue even after I left. The secrets, the threats, the unresolved murder, they were seeds, and seeds needed soil. I was soil now. I turned, heading for the door. Shadows lingered at the edges, silent, watching. The whispers faded to quiet murmurs just beneath hearing, but I knew they would never leave. The ledger's weight pressed against my chest, heavier than before. It contained more than numbers, more than threats. It contained attention, memory, and a slow-growing insistence that one day it would demand action. I stepped into the corridor beyond. The hall behind me stretched, empty now, yet filled with the weight of those lost, those warned, those silenced. I didn't look back, but I could feel the ledger pulling me forward, into the next shadow, into the next memory, into whatever would come. And I knew the factory would remember me too. Even as I left, the whispers followed, faint, persistent. And somewhere beneath the hum of the old machinery, a question lingered. Who will be next? The door creaked when I pushed it open, a thin, protesting sound that seemed louder than it had any right to be. Steam curled around my legs, clinging like cobwebs, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the haze, a shadow that wasn't mine, shifting just out of reach. The factory was quiet, almost painfully so, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it in the air, heavy and patient, waiting for me to make a misstep. Every step I took echoed on the concrete, hollow and uneven. The walls seemed to lean in closer, and the smell of damp metal and stale paper pressed against my chest. I tried to shake the feeling off, tell myself it was the old building settling, but deep down I knew better. The ledger had left a mark. It wasn't just history anymore. It was alive, reaching through the cracks of the walls, following me with unseen eyes. I glanced back. The boiler room's entrance was shrouded in mist, steam rising in lazy spirals that looked almost human. My mind tricked me into seeing faces there, men and women staring, mouths open, silent, pleading. One in particular caught my eye, Thomas Keene, the one whose death had been scrawled across the ledger in frantic ink. His face twisted with fear, yet there was something else in his eyes, something accusing. I shook my head. It had to be imagination. It had to. But then I heard it. A soft metallic clatter. Nothing large, nothing threatening. Just a tap-tap like someone setting a tool down too carefully. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. The sound repeated, slow, deliberate, coming from deeper inside the factory. Not the boiler room, not the office where I'd found the ledger. Somewhere beyond, where the shadows pooled and the quiet grew almost solid. I wanted to run, wanted to leave it all behind. The steam, the whispers, the ledger. But something rooted me in place. Curiosity or fear or maybe both. I had to know what remained here, what the factory had refused to release. My shoes squeaked across the wet floor, leaving prints that vanished almost instantly into the mist. Each footprint felt like a confession, a marker of trespass in a place that had long forgotten how to forgive. The corridors stretched longer than memory allowed. Doors that should have been shut were open, dark and yawning. I passed rooms filled with discarded machinery, conveyor belts frozen mid-motion, and stacks of crates that seemed to lean toward me impatiently. It wasn't just silence that filled the space, it was expectation. A weight that pressed in from all sides, reminding me that the crimes committed here were not done with paper and ink alone. They lingered, watching, waiting. I paused at a doorway. Inside, sunlight from a high window slanted across the floor, cutting through the lingering steam. Dust motes danced in the shafts like tiny ghosts. The ledger's warnings echoed in my mind. Do not leave it behind. Do not ignore. One remains. The words trembled, not on the page now, but in my chest. I didn't know who one referred to or whether the threat was past, present, or future. I only knew it was close. A draft hissed along the hall. My skin prickled. The faintest whisper brushed my ear, a voice so soft I thought I had imagined it. He never left. I spun, heart in my throat, empty corridor. My shadow stretched long and thin against the wall, a dark twin I couldn't shake. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, a trick of the building's old plumbing, but the words lingered in my mind. Whoever or whatever was here had not moved on. I reached the main hall, a cavernous space with high ceilings and rusting girders. The machinery here had been massive once, now frozen like monuments to effort long forgotten. Conveyor belts slanted at odd angles, gears protruded from broken panels, and the walls were scuffed and darkened by age and neglect. Yet the hall didn't feel abandoned. It felt like a stage, and I had walked straight into a performance that had never ended. Footsteps behind me, not loud, not deliberate, just the faintest brush like someone packing, keeping pace with me unseen. I didn't dare look. The ledger's warnings were clear. Attention is dangerous. I didn't know if the threat was human or something older, something stitched into the building itself. The thought made my skin crawl, my fingers tighten around the leather strap of my bag, clutching it like a talisman. I moved toward the exit, yet every turn revealed more. A row of lockers, each dented and scratched, names still etched in fading ink. Notes tucked in cracks, warnings, apologies, confessions. Reminders that the factory had swallowed lives quietly without notice, leaving only traces in metal, paper, and shadow. One locker bore a note written hastily. He watches the ledger. He remembers everything. The words weren't ink anymore. They were etched into the air itself, pressing in on me. A door slammed somewhere deep within the hall. The sound was sharp, violent, almost human. I jumped, then froze. The building breathed around me, the groan of beams, the hiss of pipes, the whispering drafts. And beneath it all, faint but deliberate, the echo of steps following mine, always a half step behind. I couldn't tell if I was being hunted or guided. I rounded a corner and nearly collided with a stack of crates. One toppled, scattering old papers across the floor. I crouched, gathering them, and noticed something new. Photographs, faded and curling. Workers in grim poses, frozen smiles, eyes too wide, too knowing. Faces I had passed in the shadow of the ledger's warnings. They seemed to lean toward me, not threatening but expectant. Watching. Remembering. The hall stretched endlessly ahead. Each doorway, each window, each shadow seemed familiar, yet subtly altered. I could swear the boiler room lay to my right, though it had been behind me only moments ago. The factory was shifting, replaying its memory, looping itself around me. Every corner held a question I couldn't answer. Where had the dead been taken? Who had survived? Who remained unseen? I reached the main exit. Sunlight spilled across the threshold, golden and inviting. Relief surged, and I almost ran, almost thought I could leave the weight of the ledger and the shadows behind. But the moment my fingers touched the handle, the air thickened. I could feel it, pressure, subtle but undeniable, like lungs squeezing the hall tight. The whispers surged, overlapping. He never left. You cannot leave. Not yet. I stumbled back inside, heart racing, breath ragged. The exit no longer seemed an exit. It was a frame, a memory, a boundary the factory refused to grant. Shadows stretched along the walls, pooling around machinery, twisting into shapes that hinted at movement, intent, life. I realized then that leaving would not be simple. The unresolved crimes, the threats, the ledger, they were part of the building itself now, and it remembered me. I retraced my steps, following the corridors I thought I knew, yet each turn revealed more. A boiler hissed, sending steam curling in serpentine coils across the floor. Papers fluttered as if moved by unseen hands. The photographs along the walls seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. Eyes tracking, heads tilting. The factory was alive with attention, silent yet vigilant, and I was its newest visitor. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum like metal flexing under stress. Not machinery, not wind. Something deep, resonant, vibrating through the floor and walls. I knelt, pressed my hand to the concrete, and felt the pulse of memory beneath my fingers. Every missing worker, every whispered threat, every unsolved death. The building had absorbed it all. And now it pulsed beneath me, patient, deliberate. I stood, moving forward cautiously. The main hall was vast and cavernous. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching toward me, almost beckoning. I passed a row of windows and saw nothing outside but sunlight and abandoned grounds. Yet inside, the air thrummed with presence, with attention. The ledger's weight pressed in my mind, heavier than ever. Knowledge, once gained, demanded vigilance. I realized the factory didn't just store crimes, it enforced memory, and I was a participant now. Finally, I reached the last stretch toward the door. The air was lighter here, steam thinning, shadows slinking toward the walls. Relief, brief and fragile, washed over me. I gripped the handle again, and for a heartbeat it seemed possible to step into the sun, leave it all behind. And then I heard a whisper from behind, soft, intimate. "You'll return. You always do." I froze. The voice didn't belong to any person I had seen. It belonged to the building itself, the ledger, the memory of all it had contained. I stepped forward anyway, pushing through the handle. The sunlight touched my face, warm, blinding. Behind me, the factory exhaled, a long, low sigh that carried the weight of all the unresolved crimes, all the unanswered questions. I emerged. Air smelled sweet, fresh, indifferent. The factory stood behind me, silent yet alive. I turned back one last glance, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow at the highest window, leaning out, watching. But the light shifted and it was gone. Only the memory remained, heavy in my chest. Even now, walking away, I can feel it, the echo of voices, the pull of unfinished stories, the pressure of secrets that will not rest. The building waits, patient, attentive. The ledger waits too, somewhere in the shadows, ready for the next reader. And I know as I walk into the quiet day that leaving the steam behind does not mean leaving the factory behind. Something in me has stayed. Something in the factory has moved forward. And somewhere between shadow and light, a question lingers. When will it reach for me again? The door groaned the moment I pushed it open, a sound sharp enough to make me flinch. Darkness swallowed the hallway, but the lights, faint, inconsistent and maddening, flickered overhead. I froze. How could anything flicker when the breakers were long dead? My eyes darted across the room, catching the gleam of metal panels, conveyor belts frozen mid-motion, and a thick layer of dust disturbed only by me. The rhythmic clicking started almost immediately. Not loud, not chaotic, but insistent, like a metronome counting down to something I didn't understand. Each click bounced off the walls, warped by shadows that seemed alive, swaying as if they had their own will. I swallowed hard, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I shouldn't be here. The factory had been abandoned for years. The machines should have been silent. Yet here they were, clicking, flickering, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I took a tentative step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath me, groaning like they resented my presence. Shadows stretched from the machines, twisting into shapes that my mind almost recognized. Faces, limbs, I couldn't tell. I wanted to look away, but something kept me rooted: curiosity, fear, the impossible need to understand. A flicker overhead made the room plunge into near darkness. For a heartbeat, I felt like I wasn't alone. My reflection, or something that mimicked it, glimmered in a dark window pane. Not exactly me, though. Wrong posture, slightly off, almost smiling. The lights returned, jerking to life, and the figure was gone. My pulse hammered, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I stepped forward anyway, drawn toward the source of the clicking. Machines lined the hall like sentinels. Their metal surfaces were corroded, dented, layered with grime, yet the clicking continued, rhythmical, precise, as if the factory remembered some task it had never finished. I moved closer to a control panel, old switches frozen mid-toggle. I touched the surface. Cold, smooth, dead. And yet the clicking didn't stop. I pulled my hand back sharply, certain I'd felt something beneath the metal, subtle, a vibration like the pulse of a heartbeat. I turned a corner and the shadows pooled thick, almost viscous. The lights above flickered faster now, barely giving shape to the machinery and workstations. I could swear the shadows were moving independently, inching along the walls, crawling toward me, testing my courage. My chest tightened and my fingers trembled as I reached for the next doorway. Through it I saw more. Conveyor belts, gears, small monitors cracked and frozen mid-screen. Yet faint lights blinked on them, dim, irregular, as if the machines were breathing. I leaned closer, reading the labels. Something inside me recognized them. Projects left unfinished, wires still coiled like snakes, schematics half-drawn and smeared with dust. And beneath all of it, the faint hum of memory, of work interrupted, of lives that had vanished with the flick of a breaker. The clicking shifted, slower, deliberate. Behind me, a shadow detached from the rest, dark against darker corners. I froze. It moved with purpose. I stepped back, heart hammering, and the lights pulsed, shadows stretching and shrinking with each flicker. I could feel it following, patient, waiting for me to make a mistake. I tried to tell myself it was imagination. Factories breathe. Buildings settle, shadows stretch. But the pattern was too precise, too calculated. My mind resisted, yet curiosity edged me forward. Another doorway, another room. Here the clicking was louder, reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat. Machines lined up as if mid-shift. Panels blinked with numbers that made no sense, dates from decades ago, sequences that no human would recall. And yet they ran, endlessly repeating, echoing some ritual long forgotten. A screen flickered to life, brief like a heartbeat, showing a frame of a person, or a reflection of a person moving within the machinery. Only it wasn't me. Their posture wrong, limbs bent unnaturally, head tilting too far. The frame vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving nothing but the low hum of circuits long dead. My pulse raced. I knew I shouldn't look back, yet I couldn't resist. The corridor behind me stretched unnaturally. Lights overhead blinked sporadically, casting everything in a liminal glow. Shadows coiled around the machines, pooling at the edges of the room, growing longer, thinner, almost reaching. Each step I took echoed like a warning. I felt like I had walked into a memory, a factory replaying its final day on an infinite loop. And someone or something was still caught inside, trapped in the rhythm, waiting for recognition. A console sparked, tiny arcs of electricity jumping over rusted metal. The clicking stuttered, hesitated, then resumed, slower this time, deliberate. I leaned closer, seeing faint imprints in the dust, footprints, handprints, marks of hurried movement. Someone had left in a rush or been taken. I traced them lightly with my finger. They didn't feel like history. They felt like presence, watching me, testing me. I backed away slowly, realizing I couldn't follow the rhythm forever. Each corridor looked the same. Each shadow seemed familiar. The factory's heartbeat was palpable now, synchronous with my own. My ears picked up subtle whispers beneath the clicking, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to come from the machinery itself. Names, fragments of conversation, faint laughter, echoes of people long gone, yet impossible to ignore. One doorway at the far end caught my attention. The lights inside were steadier, warmer somehow despite their flicker. I stepped closer. Rusted levers, shattered monitors, coiled wires everywhere. The clicking paused briefly, as if the factory itself was holding its breath. Then it began again, slower, more purposeful, accompanied by a faint hissing, like steam escaping somewhere far below. I felt compelled to enter, though every instinct screamed to turn away. Inside, I found a control board, panels lined with dusty switches. A faded sign read, "Do not touch, system unstable." The warning didn't stop my fingers from brushing a lever. Cold metal, a slight vibration beneath my touch. And then the lights surged briefly, flickering wildly, shadows jerking across the room in erratic dances. For a moment, I thought I saw figures moving just beyond the machines, blurred and fast, disappearing when I blinked. I stepped back, my chest heaved. The factory was alive yet inert. It breathed, remembered, observed. The clicking slowed again, becoming almost a whisper, fading into the hum of wires and circuits. I realized then that the lights were not malfunctioning. They were deliberate. Every flicker, every pulse, every shadow was a message, a memory replaying itself, a story demanding attention. I turned to leave, but the corridor stretched beyond memory. Doors I had passed were gone, replaced by walls and shadow. A faint outline of a window glowed far off. My footsteps echoed, uncertain, unsure if I was moving forward or being drawn backward. The clicking followed me, patient, precise. The factory didn't just exist, it watched. It measured my fear, my curiosity, my hesitation. Finally, I saw it, the exit. Light from outside poured faintly through a cracked door. Relief surged. My hand reached for the handle, and then the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching into angles impossible for any human eye to track. The clicking stopped abruptly, leaving only the low hum of circuits and the echo of whispers. I stepped through. Sunlight hit my face, warm and real. Behind me, the factory exhaled, a subtle sigh that carried the weight of everything left unfinished. The clicking faded into memory, but the shadows didn't entirely vanish. Even outside, I could feel them lurking at the edge of vision, patient, waiting. I turned back once. The building loomed silent and still. Yet I knew it wasn't empty. Not truly. The machines, the lights, the echoes, they remembered. And so did the shadows. And somewhere in the rhythm of flickering lights and clicking machines, the factory waited for its next visitor. Even now, as I walk away, I feel the pulse of that place. The rhythm of its memory, the unfinished stories, the silent watchers, all of it pressing at the edges of my mind. The factory waits, and I know eventually I will return. The air was thick the moment I stepped deeper into the factory, heavier than the dust and rust I expected. The lights still flickered, but now it was the shadows that held my attention. They seemed to whisper, moving across walls and machinery like memories trying to speak. I froze, listening. At first I thought it was the wind, settling in broken vents. Then words began to take shape, soft, fragmented, impossible to catch fully. "You think you'll back down?" a voice murmured, low and urgent. I jerked my head, but the shadows offered nothing. No one was there. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a recording. It was alive, present. I took a step forward and the whispers followed, weaving through the flickering light, dancing across my ears. "He's always in the way," another voice hissed. Anger, fear, regret, all tangled into one fragile thread. I realized these weren't random echoes. These were voices I was never meant to hear. I edged along a row of silent machines. The clicking from the previous room had slowed, almost thoughtful, like the factory itself was pausing to watch. My foot caught on a coiled wire. I yanked it free, cursing under my breath. The voices didn't stop. They became clearer, fragments of names, accusations, promises broken decades ago. I could hear laughter, mocking, bitter, followed by a hiss of fear. Someone had died here, that much was certain. The room opened into what had once been the night shift area. Long tables, chairs tipped over, papers scattered in frozen disarray. I bent to examine a yellow document, and the air shifted, heavy and cold, as if the factory exhaled through the cracks in the walls. The voices rose, overlapping now, a chorus of grievance, betrayal, murmurs of deals gone wrong. I could almost see them, the workers long gone, replaying their grudges endlessly in the shadows. A photograph, faded and curling at the edges, caught my eye. A group of men posed grimly, eyes hollow, smiles forced or absent. I traced one figure with my finger. The image shimmered slightly under the flickering lights, and a voice whispered sharply, "He didn't belong." My heart thudded. I looked up, scanning the room. Nothing moved, yet everything felt alive. The shadows shifted again, dragging themselves along walls and machinery, and I could almost see the tension frozen in those faces. I followed the whispers to the far corner, where a desk still held fragments of the night shift ledger. Papers were brittle, typed letters yellowed. My hand hovered over one, hesitant. As soon as I touched it, a new wave of voices surged, louder now, overlapping in a tangled chorus. Arguments, threats, accusations of sabotage, someone promising they'd make it right, someone else laughing at their failures. And beneath it all, one quiet, mournful tone, a name. Only one, repeated over and over. I didn't recognize it, but my stomach churned. This person had vanished, and the factory still remembered. I pulled back from the desk, trying to make sense of the fragments. Rivalries, debts unpaid, whispers of blackmail. Every word, every hiss seemed layered with anger and fear, as though the very walls had absorbed decades of resentment. And yet the more I listened, the more coherent the story became. The night shift hadn't just ended, they had been broken, one by one. A warning, a punishment, a secret carried into death. I moved toward the center of the room, drawn by a flicker of movement in the shadows. A chair rocked slowly, pushed by no wind, no hand. I froze. My reflection appeared in a cracked window beside it, haggard, tense, but behind me in the corner of the glass a shadow lingered. It didn't move naturally. Its shape was too wrong, limbs too elongated, posture impossible. And yet I felt it observing me, waiting. "Don't touch it," a voice whispered soft near my ear. I spun around. Nothing. The shadows pressed closer, curling and writhing as if alive. I could feel the weight of those decades, the grudges and betrayals pressing through the walls, trying to tell their story. I could follow it, trace it back, see what had happened that night. Or I could leave, pretending ignorance. But I needed to know. Curiosity, fear, something deeper, it compelled me forward. I rifled through the ledger carefully, as though disturbing the pages too much might awaken the voices into anger. Names, shifts, small notes in margins. Late again, watch him. He's a problem, handle it. And one entry different from the rest, typed carefully but underlined. Do not trust him, tonight he pays. My hand trembled. My pulse raced. The shadows seemed to curl tighter, as if approving that I had seen it. The clicking from earlier returned, slow now, methodical, like footsteps following my heart. I looked up and the shadows shifted unnaturally toward the wall, gathering, pooling like dark water. The voices grew louder, more frantic, voices of argument, pleading, warning. Then silence except for a single chilling whisper. He's watching. My breath caught. Who? What? The factory. One of them. The shadow flickered across the wall, elongated and jagged, before disappearing behind a stack of metal crates. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, and the voices recoiled, almost afraid. I could feel the story pivoting, as if my presence had disturbed the delicate balance. One name, repeated like a mantra, echoed in my mind. It was the unresolved death, the one-night shift worker who had disappeared. The ledger hinted at foul play, betrayal, secrets buried deeper than the dust covering the floor. I shivered, realizing the factory didn't just hold memories. It held judgment. It preserved the consequences. I backed away toward the doorway, but the shadows moved faster now, elongating across the floor, curling around machines, pooling near the exit. I could hear faint laughter, mocking, bitter, as if the factory itself mocked my hesitation. One figure, or perhaps more, shifted in the corner of my vision. I could never focus on it long enough to see clearly. Limbs bent wrong, posture twisted. It was not human, yet it moved with purpose, and I knew it had remembered everything. The ledger slipped from my hands, falling to the floor with a whispering crash. The voices rose in reaction, a cacophony of anger, fear, betrayal. I pressed my back against a machine, trembling, heart hammering. My own shadow stretched beside me, uncomfortably alive. And then, suddenly, quiet. The voices didn't stop completely, but they softened, almost mournful, as if letting me catch my breath. I looked at the papers on the floor. Names, accusations, secrets. The unresolved death stared back at me through time. I could feel it, like a weight pressing in my chest, a knot tightening in my stomach. I wanted to leave, to escape the weight of decades, but the factory didn't let me go so easily. The shadows lingered, the whispers persisted, each flicker of light a reminder that I had entered a space that refused to forget. I forced myself forward, stepping toward the corridor that led away from the night shift room. Each step echoed differently now, heavy with anticipation. The shadows followed, patient, observing, but the voices seemed to respect my movement. Perhaps they wanted acknowledgement, or perhaps they simply wanted witnesses. I could feel their stories pressing into me, desperate to be remembered, desperate to be understood. The corridor stretched on, lined with machinery that had once hummed with life. Faded signs hung crookedly. Authorized personnel only and night shift, last entry, 1979. My fingers brushed them, feeling the texture of old paint and dust. The whispers softened, yet remained, carrying fragments of argument, betrayal, a warning I could not yet comprehend. One phrase repeated more than any other. He shouldn't have come back. I paused, considering. Had the factory sensed me as an intruder? Or had it recognized something in me, a curiosity it could not resist? The shadows lingered at the edges of vision, just beyond focus, teasing, testing. I felt my breath slow, trying to steady my mind to absorb what I had learned without succumbing to fear. The unresolved death, the betrayal, the rivalry, the threats, all pressed around me, shaping the air itself. A sudden flicker overhead drew my eyes up. Light cascaded unevenly, painting the machines in shifting patterns. I saw shapes I had not noticed before, prints in dust, objects displaced, signs of struggle. The voices swelled again, overlapping, demanding attention. I realized that leaving now would mean taking only fragments, leaving the rest behind. And yet the urge to escape, to breathe outside air, was overwhelming. I exhaled slowly and moved forward past the corridor, past the machinery. The shadows thinned, the whispers softened, but the weight of history lingered. I could feel the night shift worker's absence like a chill in my bones, The betrayal, the rivalry, the final unresolved act pressing in even as I stepped closer to the exit. I knew the factory had given me only a glimpse. The story was incomplete. Outside, the air was stale but real. The sunlight was weak but solid. I took a deep breath and for the first time in hours felt some release. And yet behind me the factory's shadow pressed against the walls. The voices, faint now, murmured, remembered, waited. I knew they would remain, trapped in the machinery and the flickering lights, waiting for someone else to listen. Someone else to witness the betrayals and the unresolved death. As I walked away, I could not shake the feeling that I had left part of myself inside the shadows, trapped with the voices. They had whispered their story, but their questions remained. Who had killed him? Who had betrayed whom? And why did the factory keep their memories alive, replaying them endlessly for anyone foolish or curious enough to enter? I didn't turn back, not yet, but I knew the factory would not forget me either. I didn't plan to follow the deeper corridors, but something in the shadows drew me. It wasn't curiosity alone. It was the factory itself, guiding me with a pulse, a rhythm I felt in the soles of my feet. The air thickened as I moved, heavy with heat and the faint tang of oil, and somewhere in the hum of machinery I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep echoing in the distance. I froze. The corridor was empty. Dust swirled in the weak beams of flickering light. The sound came again, soft but distinct, as if someone very alive was packing just beyond my reach. I wanted to call out to ask who was there, but my throat clenched. A memory, or was it a shadow, slipped past the corner of my eye. A man crouched, hands pressed to his ears, eyes wide, watching something I couldn't see. The floorboards creaked beneath me. I pressed against a wall, heart hammering, trying to orient myself. A cabinet long abandoned had spilled its contents, tools scattered like the remnants of a life interrupted. I recognized the shapes: pliers, wrenches, a soldering iron crusted with rust, but my eyes caught something else. A smudge of fresh dust had been disturbed, recent, deliberate. Not my steps, not mine. A whisper brushed past my ear, too close to be imagined. Hide before he finds you. I spun around, nothing. The corridor stretched endlessly, machinery standing like sentinels, shadows pooling in corners. My hand found the edge of a doorway. Inside, a small room, office-sized, long since abandoned, walls peeling, ceiling damp. And there he was. Or rather, he appeared, flickering like a reflection in broken glass. A man crouched in the corner, knees pulled to his chest, clutching a rusted flashlight. He trembled. His eyes darted wide, terrified. My stomach dropped. This was the last technician, the one the factory never forgot, the one who had vanished decades ago. I could feel it in the air, the replay of his final moments etched into the walls, carved into the machinery. He moved as if avoiding something, every motion careful, silent. Shadows stretched across the room, curling unnaturally. I realized he wasn't just hiding from darkness. He was hiding from someone or something that moved with him just beyond his vision. I wanted to warn him, but he didn't hear me. He couldn't. And then I understood. I was seeing what the factory wanted me to see. The past and present folded together here, impossible to separate. The technician rose slowly, peering over the edge of a desk. His face was pale, drawn, eyes wide with a fear I recognized immediately. Not of dying, not of machines, but of being watched, pursued. I followed his gaze, searching, but the shadows held their secrets. A chair tipped over, but no hand had moved it. Footsteps echoed, rapid, deliberate, closing in. He ducked behind the desk, barely breathing. I felt a chill creep up my spine. A whisper, urgent, sharp, hissed from the walls. He's coming, he's always coming. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to keep distance. The technician moved again, glancing toward a side corridor, a place I hadn't noticed before. He paused, shivering, then bolted. The air seemed to thicken as he passed, like the shadows themselves were reaching out to grab him. I wanted to follow, to intervene, but every instinct told me to stay back. I wasn't supposed to change this memory. I was supposed to witness it. The corridor swallowed him. Footsteps pounded behind, closer now, echoing against metal walls. A faint scraping, a breath too loud, a shadow stretching and twisting along the floor. It was impossible to tell what was memory and what was presence. And then the voices joined in, overlapping, urgent, warning, pleading. Don't look back, don't move, don't breathe too loud. I realized I had been holding my breath, trying not to disturb the fragile thread of his final moments. A sudden flicker revealed him again, crouched near a service hatch. He reached for the handle, trembling, fingers shaking. And then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the wall behind him. Not human, impossibly long, bending the corners of the room like wet clay. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence oppressive, patient. I could feel the technician's fear radiating through the air, mingling with my own. He opened the hatch and slipped inside, darkness swallowing him. The shadow hesitated, then leaned over, its form bending toward the void he had entered. I pressed against the opposite wall, heart hammering. The factory was alive around me. The floors, the ceilings, the very air humming with tension. The technician's last moments played on repeat, a loop of terror that had no clear ending. The voices softened briefly, murmurs of relief, of fear subsiding for a heartbeat. And then a new whisper, "You can't leave either." I staggered back, almost tripping over a metal beam. The shadows shifted with me, curling, teasing, following. The factory wanted me to understand what had happened here, and the more I resisted, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a memory. It was a warning, a trap, a story etched into reality itself. I traced my fingers along a wall, noticing scratches I hadn't before, tiny grooves like fingernails climbing toward the ceiling. The shadow that had pursued the technician moved across the floor, stretching impossibly long, then dissolved into the air as if it had never been there. Yet I could feel it. The air felt thicker, heavier, waiting. The technician reappeared in fragments here, crouched behind machinery there, pressed against the floor, ears covered, eyes wide. Each fragment replayed a choice, a hesitation, a terror that had cost him his life. I realized the factory didn't just remember him. It preserved him, replayed him, made me complicit in witnessing his suffering. And through it all, a single question burned. Who or what had driven him to this? I moved slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the side corridor he had fled into. The shadows leaned in, watching, and the voices whispered in overlapping waves. Rivalries, threats, accusations. I could hear pieces of it now, fragments of what had led to that night. One worker had been jealous, another vindictive. Someone had wanted him gone, and the factory had held that memory like a wound, refusing to heal. A door at the end of the corridor stood ajar. A flickering light from within cast the shadows long and thin. I could hear breathing, not my own, deeper. Slower, almost deliberate, I stepped closer. A chair tipped over inside, metal scraping against the concrete. And then I saw it, a figure slumped against a control panel, unmoving. My heart skipped. The technician, or a memory of him. The figure shivered, jerking slightly. A low, rasping whisper, "Don't go further." I swallowed hard. The air was heavy with oil and rust and something else I couldn't name. My hand reached out, almost touching the figure. And in that instant, the shadows moved again, curling along the walls, stretching toward me. I could feel their patience, their deliberation. They had waited decades for someone to witness, and now they had me. I stepped back. The figure vanished, or perhaps I had blinked. The voices shifted, fragments of argument and warning overlapping, creating a rhythm I could not escape. I realized the factory had replayed everything for me, not to terrify, but to teach, to warn. The technician had been alone, yes. Trapped, yes. But he had also been part of a web that no one else could see. A web that might still be active. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling sagging, the walls closing in subtly. Every step made a whisper echo in my ears. "He saw you, he knows." I turned to look back. Shadows pooled behind me, darker than before, moving with intent. My own shadow stretched across the floor, unnaturally long, bending toward the walls. The factory wasn't just replaying a memory. It was layering it onto reality, folding past and present together, and I had become a part of it. I pressed forward toward the faint light at the end of the corridor, my breath shallow. The figure appeared again, crouched near the hatch he had fled through before, watching, waiting. I realized the factory was giving me a choice. witness everything or turn away and leave incomplete truths behind. And the weight of knowing, the responsibility of seeing, pressed into me like iron. The technician's final moments crouched, terrified, hunted, replayed in my mind one fragment after another. I understood now. This wasn't a haunting in the usual sense. It was a record, a warning, a story preserved in air and shadow and memory. And the deeper I went, the more I felt the factory observing me, testing me, preparing me. I stepped out of the corridor into a wider room, machinery silent now, shadows pooling, watching. The figure had disappeared, or perhaps never existed outside my perception. Yet the feeling remained, a pressure in the air, a weight pressing against my chest. The voices had softened but were not gone. One phrase lingered: he shouldn't have returned. I realized then that the factory had shared its story but left questions unanswered. The technician had vanished, pursued by shadows and grudges. Someone had wanted him gone. But why? And what exactly was still waiting in the darkness? The factory held the answer, layered in shadow and memory, but I had only glimpsed it. I stepped toward the exit, each footfall deliberate. Outside, the air was cooler, lighter, but the memory of the technician's fear of the shadows lingered. I knew I had not left the factory untouched. Part of it had come with me, and I could feel, somewhere deep in the shadows, that the story was not finished. The factory remembered, and now so did I. The first time I saw it, I almost walked past without noticing. A door, hidden behind stacks of rotting paper and a collapsed shelving unit. Rust had eaten the hinges, and the padlock looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Something about it made my skin crawl. I felt drawn, like it was calling me, whispering from behind the metal and decay. I pressed my hand against the cold steel. The scratch of metal against metal sounded from inside, a faint rhythm, irregular but deliberate. My heartbeat quickened. Was someone trapped in there? Or was it something else? The noise stopped when I froze, as if it had been listening to me. I crouched down to inspect the padlock. Deep grooves and corrosion made it impossible to open with bare hands. I felt along the doorframe, tracing the rusted edges. Beneath my fingers, the metal shivered slightly, like it resented my touch. I stepped back, startled, certain I'd imagined it, and the scratching started again, closer this time. The factory smelled of damp paper and mildew. Sunlight barely reached this corner. Shadows pooled thickly along the floor. I tried to peer under the door, but darkness swallowed every inch. Then I noticed a faint smear along the bottom, a streak of something dark and sticky. I couldn't tell if it was oil, rust, or something else entirely. The air felt heavier. I leaned in, straining to hear. The scratches had a pattern now, almost like fingernails dragging, slow and deliberate. The sound moved, scuttling from one side of the door to the other. A whisper, or maybe my imagination, threaded through it. Open, find me. I stepped back. Rationally, I told myself there was nothing in there, just a forgotten storage room. But the room, the factory, seemed alive, pressing against my thoughts. Every beam, every stack of paper, every rusted machine felt like it had been waiting for me. I crouched closer again, peering into a tiny crack between the door and the floor. Shadows shifted. The scratches paused. A hollow sigh seemed to escape the floor itself. I blinked, heart racing, convinced I'd seen a figure crouched in the corner. A technician maybe, or a worker who had been forgotten by time. But when I looked again, nothing. Only the shadows, thick and silent. I circled the door, looking for another way in. Behind a stack of crates, a vent almost hidden in the wall. It led into the same room, I was sure of it. I pressed my ear to the grate. The scratching stopped entirely. For a long, tense moment, I heard nothing. And then another sound, low, wet scraping. Not nails, something sharper, moving with intent. The factory around me hummed faintly. Machines, dead for years, seemed to echo the sound in ghostly resonance. I stepped back from the vent, breathing hard. The door called to me still. I wanted to run, leave, forget I had even seen it. But my legs moved forward anyway. Every instinct screamed against it, but something deeper, curiosity or maybe fear, kept me rooted there. I ran a hand along the door again. The padlock was cold, heavy, unyielding. I crouched, trying to peer through a crack at the top of the door. My eyes adjusted to the shadows. Faint shapes moved inside. They weren't clear, just a dark blur shifting, almost pulsing with life. And then the scratching started again, right at the center of the door. Quick, sharp, insistent. My stomach churned. A sound from the floor behind me made me spin. A loose metal plate clattered to the ground. Shadows shifted. I was alone. I told myself that. But my mind had already begun playing tricks, connecting scratches and shadows into something deliberate. Something that wanted me to see it. Something that had been waiting. I knelt, pressing my eye to a small gap near the lock. The scratches were closer now, almost right under my nose. The shadow inside moved, curling, twisting, almost human. And then I saw it, a hand, thin, pale, stretching through the crack. Fingernails long, curled, dragging across the wood. I jerked back, stomach twisting. My heart raced, every instinct screaming to run, but my eyes were drawn back compulsively to the door. The factory seemed to inhale around me, heavy with dust and history. The hand retracted and the scratches stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and almost unbearable. Then a whisper. Clear this time, urgent. Don't leave me, do. I stumbled back. My head spun with questions. Was it a person trapped? Or had the factory claimed something else decades ago, something that never left? The room behind the door seemed to pulse, a heartbeat I could feel through the floorboards. Shadows shifted again, darker, deeper. The padlock glimmered in a single shaft of light, almost alive. I circled the door slowly, my eyes searching for another weakness. The vent above, the small crack at the base, the warped hinges, all potential entrances. The air shifted. A sudden chill swept past me, brushing my neck like a hand. I froze. The scratching resumed, deliberate, almost impatient. I realized it had changed. The rhythm was different, faster, sharper, more purposeful. I pressed my palm against the door. The vibrations traveled up my arm, deep into my chest. Something inside stirred, aware of me, aware of my presence. The factory seemed to lean closer, walls narrowing subtly. Shadows pooled under the door, crawling like ink across the floor. And then a whisper. You're too late, you shouldn't have come. I staggered, taking a step back. The vent rattled above me. I looked up, nothing moved. But the sound persisted, scraping metal against metal, faint, deliberate, coming closer. My mind raced. What had been locked away for decades was alive somehow, waiting, patient, playing with me. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt it watching from the dark corners, the floor, the ceiling. The padlock gleamed under a weak sunbeam. I touched it again. The scratches came in quick succession, frantic, almost desperate. A shadow darted behind the door. For a moment I could swear I saw a figure crouched low, eyes gleaming, lips moving in a silent plea. And then nothing. Silence pressed in again, heavy, suffocating. I leaned close, listening, faint breathing. Slow, ragged, echoing in the small room. I couldn't tell if it was mine or theirs. And then faintly, unmistakably, a voice from inside. Please help me. I stumbled back, panic rising. This was no ordinary locked room. This was a trap, a snare, a memory that had become something else. Something alive. The door vibrated under my hands, subtly at first, then more insistently, as if the thing inside was pushing, pressing against the wood, demanding release. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But my eyes, my mind, were drawn again to the small gap at the top of the door. Shapes moved inside, blurred, almost human, shifting in and out of view. The whispers multiplied. Open free, don't leave, my chest tightened. The factory had made them patient, decades patient, and now it had me. A sudden metallic clang echoed from the far end of the room. I spun. Shadows shifted. The vent rattled again, and then silence. The padlock sat cold and inert, but the room behind it pulsed like a heartbeat, alive, aware. The scratches had stopped for now, but the air itself seemed to lean in, heavy, waiting. I realized I couldn't leave. Not yet. The factory wouldn't let me. The rusted door, the padlock, the scratches, they were a message, a warning, a challenge. And somewhere beyond, in the darkness, whatever was trapped was waiting, patient, watching, whispering. and I knew with a sick certainty that the scratches wouldn't stop. Not for me. Not ever. I stepped back, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to flee, but my eyes stayed on the door. The shadows pooled thicker along the floor. The whisper came again, clear, urgent. "Don't leave me, not yet." And then the scratching started again. The walls were thinner than I expected. Thin enough that when I pressed my face to a crack in the plaster, I could see traces of a life long abandoned. Dust settled in thick layers over every surface, but it was the arrangement of things that made me stop. Desks, chairs, a toppled filing cabinet, all positioned as if someone had been interrupted mid-task. I leaned closer. Old papers scattered across the floor caught the dim light, their edges curled and yellowed. There were notebooks, scraps of letters, even a small photograph of a man in a uniform smiling into a camera. I traced it with my fingertip through the glass of the crack, feeling a tug in my chest. Who had been here? What had they left behind, and why had it been sealed off? The smell of mold and paper was overpowering. I shifted closer, careful not to disturb the plaster. News clippings were pinned to a corkboard, brittle and faded. Headlines screamed of missing workers, unexplained accidents, and a few small, anonymous reports of disappearances. Their eyes, frozen in old photographs, seemed to follow me. I swallowed hard, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The factory had been hiding them. A small drawer, half open under one of the desks, caught my attention. Inside, a collection of personal belongings, an old pocket watch, a frayed notebook, a woman's hairpin, each item carefully preserved by dust. I imagined the hands that had touched them last, the lives that had been abruptly cut off. I felt a sudden, irrational fear that these walls still remembered, that they still wanted something from me. The crack widened slightly as I shifted. A shadow moved across the room beyond, though there was no one there. My heart skipped. I stepped back instinctively, almost knocking over a rusted filing cabinet behind me. The sound echoed in the emptiness, startling in its resonance. And then the scratching began again, faint, deliberate. Not nails this time, but something softer, like fabric dragged across wood. I pressed my ear against the wall. Whispers threaded through the cracks. Not words at first, just murmurs, but then they grew coherent. Arguments from decades ago, voices laced with tension, betrayal, fear. One man accusing another of taking credit for work, a woman pleading for fairness, a voice pleading, then cut off abruptly. The air grew heavier, thickening with the residue of anger and despair. I pulled back, trying to make sense of it. Was this memory, or something else? The room seemed to replay itself like a film trapped in time, the echoes of lives replaying endlessly. I felt like I shouldn't be seeing this, but my curiosity anchored me. I had to know what had happened here, why no one had ever come back to claim these things. The desk in front of me was scarred, the surface worn from years of invisible hands writing, tapping, pressing. A pencil lay on the floor nearby, sharpened, brittle. I picked it up, feeling the splinters against my skin. There were faint scratches on the desktop, numbers and letters carved hurriedly. I couldn't read them clearly, but the urgency was unmistakable. Someone had been desperate. I moved closer to the wall, peering through another narrow crack. Personal items littered the floor. A watch, a wallet, a torn glove. Each item seemed to pulse with memory, as if they contained fragments of the people who had vanished. I imagined the hands that had used them, the faces that had smiled, argued, or cried here. A shiver ran down my spine. The walls were whispering again, insistently, almost impatiently. A folded newspaper, yellowed and brittle, lay near a chair. I could make out the headlines about missing night shift workers, their names printed in bold. Some were never found. Some were discovered years later, skeletal and unidentifiable. I traced a finger along the paper through the crack. Each name felt like a weight pressing on me, and I realized the room had been recording every injustice, every untold story, holding them captive in dust and shadow. I crouched lower, trying to see more. A broken chair leaned against a desk, and under it a notebook peeking out. I reached toward it, and a sudden sound made me jump, a floorboard behind me creaking, though I had not moved. The factory was alive again, listening, aware of my presence. My heart raced, every instinct screaming to leave, but I couldn't. Something inside me demanded to keep watching. I pressed my face closer to the crack. A faint handprint marked a dusty window beyond, pressed into the grime decades ago. It looked almost human, the fingers curled, desperate. I could almost feel the pulse of that last moment fear, pleading, a silent cry. And then I realized, the shadows moved differently now. The room was shifting subtly, almost imperceptibly, like it had noticed me, adjusting itself to my gaze. Scratches ran across the floor inside the hidden room, sharp and quick. I froze. The voices rose again, snippets of arguments, accusations, then silence. The air grew colder, the dust curling into faint whorls around the corners. I felt my own breath quicken, watching as if the objects themselves were aware of my intrusion, of my curiosity. The walls weren't just hiding history, they were holding it, alive and aware. I leaned closer to see under the desk. A wallet lay open, its contents spilled. Faded photographs of people staring back at me, the edges of their faces blurred into the dust, eyes seeming to plead. One image made my stomach tight, a man in a uniform, clutching a report, eyes wide with fear. Was this the last technician, or just another worker caught in the machine of this building's silence? The scratching intensified, now accompanied by a low groan. The walls themselves seemed to shift subtly, shadows pooling around corners. I realized I could no longer tell where the room ended and the factory began. The hidden room was bleeding into the rest of the building, memories reaching out to me, tethering me to something I couldn't understand. A pile of letters caught my attention. Names, dates, accusations scribbled in urgency. I could almost hear the writers panic, feel their hands shaking. One letter ended mid-sentence, ink smeared as though the hand had been pulled away suddenly. I felt the weight of that moment, the despair frozen into paper, pressing against me. I stepped back slightly, my mind racing. Every object, every scrap of paper, every shadow whispered of unfinished stories, unresolved endings. The walls weren't just walls. They were witnesses, prisoners, and executioners all at once. I realized I was intruding on something sacred and terrible. The memories weren't just echoes. They were alive, watching me, testing me. A newspaper clipping fluttered to the floor, though no breeze touched it. My eyes widened. The factory had moved it, slowly, deliberately, as though it wanted me to see a name, a date, a crime. I picked it up with trembling hands. An unsolved disappearance from decades ago, a night shift worker gone without a trace. The words felt like acid on my skin, burning through rational thought. I heard the faintest scraping behind the walls, a movement almost imperceptible. It was a rhythm now, deliberate. Someone or something was packing inside the hidden room. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. The voices rose again, fragments overlapping, a crescendo of fear, anger, and pleading. And beneath it all, a singular, urgent whisper. Find them, find us. I backed away from the wall, my hands trembling. The factory felt alive around me, shadows pooling thicker in corners, objects shifting subtly. The hidden room had revealed its story, but not entirely. Its secrets were alive, patient, aware, waiting for someone to bear witness. I knew I couldn't stay, yet I couldn't leave, tethered by curiosity, fear, and a sense of responsibility I didn't fully understand. The scratching ceased, leaving a ringing silence. I pressed my hand to the wall, feeling the vibrations of a memory that had outlasted its owners. Dust swirled in faint eddies around the corners, shadows pooling where they shouldn't. The hidden room waited, patient, expectant, its secrets still alive behind plaster and wood. I stepped back finally, heart hammering. My eyes lingered on the crack, on the scattered remnants of forgotten lives. One thought burned. I had seen a fragment, but the full story was still waiting, just beyond reach. And I knew with an icy certainty that I would return. Because the walls had more to show. I found the ledgers in a corner, stacked like forgotten tombstones. Their leather covers were cracked, pages yellowed and curling. I brushed off the dust with my palm, watching it fall in soft clouds that seemed to carry whispers of long-ago arguments. The smell of old ink mixed with mildew hit me, heavy and suffocating. The first ledger I opened revealed rows of numbers, columns of names. At first, it seemed mundane accounting, inventory, schedules. But then I noticed the patterns. Payments that didn't make sense. Withdrawals unaccounted for. Bonuses awarded to names that didn't appear anywhere else. The handwriting varied, some neat and deliberate, others frantic, almost scratching the page. A name repeated more than the others, Donovan, the manager. He appeared in ledger after ledger, his signature sharp, commanding, and everywhere at once. I traced it with my finger, feeling a strange weight settle in my chest. There was something familiar about his name, something that hinted at stories not written, secrets not spoken. The pages revealed more than numbers. Notes in the margins, taken care of. No witnesses. Quiet before inspection. The words were simple, but the tone was deadly. Someone had been watching, calculating, making sure no one knew the whole truth. And yet the ledger existed. Somehow it had survived, almost like it had been waiting for me. I flipped to another ledger. The entries became darker, more desperate. Workers disappearing, supplies unaccounted for, threats left unsigned but unmistakable. The factory's cheerful facade had been a mask for a slow, methodical hunger. I could almost hear the footsteps of the missing, echoing across the empty halls. There were scribbled dates, some crossed out, others circled violently. One in particular caught my eye, a night in December decades ago. The notes were brief, argued with Donovan, left in office, not seen again. My throat tightened. This was no ordinary mismanagement. This was blood hidden behind numbers, lives erased in ink. I leaned back, trying to breathe, but the room seemed to contract around me. Shadows pooled in corners, thick and dark. I imagined Donovan standing there, watching me, feeling me trace his misdeeds. My mind wavered between reality and imagination, each ledger page pulling me deeper into a world of greed and silent violence. A faint scratching came from the other side of the room. I froze, staring at the ledgers as if they might speak to me. The sound was soft, deliberate, almost like someone flipping pages from beyond the grave. I told myself it was the wind, a loose shutter, anything but the truth. But the shadows were moving now, subtle ripples that didn't belong. One page had a small sketch in the margin, almost childish in its simplicity. A figure hunched over a desk, hands trembling. Another figure stood behind, looming. The detail was shocking, the angle, the posture, the tension. It was the moment of disappearance, captured by someone who had been terrified but observant. My fingers traced the lines, feeling the panic frozen in ink. I noticed a ledger tucked behind the others, its edges frayed. Opening it, I found personal notes, Donovan's thoughts recorded in a tight, controlled hand. He wrote of suspicions, fear of exposure, mentions of deals gone wrong. But then, as I read further, the handwriting became chaotic, almost illegible. Something had broken him. Something had forced him to confront consequences he couldn't escape. I stepped back from the ledgers. The floor beneath me creaked, though I had moved minimally. Shadows shifted, flickered. I felt the room breathe. Every object, every paper seemed alive, aware of my presence. And then I noticed it, a small envelope tucked between pages, addressed in a careful hand to no one. Inside was a single photograph, black and white. Donovan's face, stern, pale, eyes wide with what I can only describe as fear. Behind him, a shadowed shape lurked, impossible to identify, but its presence was undeniable. I shivered. Whoever, or whatever, was in that photograph had been there when he vanished, and somehow the ledger had kept the evidence alive. The pages continued to reveal more. Secret transfers, threats made, colleagues bribed or intimidated. There was a network of deceit so intricate it was almost elegant. The factory hadn't just consumed workers, it had consumed morality, leaving only a record of ambition and terror. I could almost hear the whispers of those wronged, rising from the pages. I felt a movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow sharper now, like the outline of a person standing just beyond the ledgers. My heart skipped. I could tell it wasn't human, not entirely. It bent the light, stretched corners of the room, and yet when I looked directly, nothing was there. Only ledgers, dust, and the faint scent of old paper. One ledger revealed a curious pattern. Every missing worker had a corresponding entry in Donovan's notes, each marked with a small symbol I didn't recognize. I traced them quickly, my pulse racing. The symbols formed a pattern across the ledger, almost like a map or a code. Could it indicate where he had hidden them? Or was it a warning, left intentionally for someone curious enough to find it? I flipped another page. There was a note scrawled across the bottom in a jagged hand. "Do not look." My stomach nodded. It wasn't a warning for me, I realized. It was a warning from Donovan to himself, or perhaps from something else entirely. The ledger had been a confession, a trap, and a memorial all at once. I looked around the room. Shadows pressed closer now, corners thickened, the air tighter. Each page I opened seemed to echo with voices, murmurs of greed, betrayal, and fear. I could almost see Donovan packing these floors, the weight of his crimes pressing down, the inevitability of his disappearance sinking into every surface. I picked up another ledger, desperate for closure. It detailed a final meeting, a confrontation. Donovan wrote of threats made, words exchanged, and someone arriving unexpectedly. The writing stopped mid-sentence. No signature, no resolution. Just the abrupt silence of someone vanished, leaving only paper and memory behind. The room seemed to shift subtly, as though the walls themselves were bending to guide my eyes. Dust swirled in faint patterns, catching the light in ways that made shapes appear and disappear. A chair moved slightly. A page flipped on its own. I tried to rationalize, but the factory's presence was undeniable. It remembered, it recorded, and now it was sharing. I leaned closer to the ledgers again. Faint impressions in the paper caught my eye, indentations from previous writing, letters pressed so deeply they were still visible decades later. I could feel the urgency, the panic, the fatal mistakes of the people who had touched these pages. Their lives replayed, frozen in ink, trapped yet speaking across time. A final ledger remained, smaller and simpler than the others. Inside, the handwriting was almost childlike, hesitant, and full of fear. It described Donovan hiding, watching someone move through the factory, the sounds of footsteps growing closer. The entry ended abruptly. No resolution. The story stopped mid-breath, as if the writer had vanished while writing. I set the ledger down slowly, my hands trembling. The room was silent yet full. Shadows pooled thicker now, corners pressing in. I realized I had traced the path of a man's undoing, seen greed, fear, and violence etched into every page. I knew the answers to some questions, but far too many remained. Where had Donovan gone? What had truly claimed him? And why did the factory insist I know this now? I took a step back, heart pounding. Dust swirled in slow eddies around the ledgers, catching faint light. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows stretching as if to remind me of their presence. I felt the weight of decades pressing down, a silent insistence that the story was far from over. And I understood finally that the ledgers weren't just paper. They were voices. They were memory. They were the factory itself, alive in its own slow, patient way, showing me a truth no one else had seen. I left the ledgers where I had found them, but I knew I couldn't leave entirely. I couldn't walk away from what I had uncovered. The factory had revealed a fragment of its history, but Donovan's fate, and the shadow that had followed him, remained unanswered. The paper trail had led me here, but the path ahead was still dark, uncertain, and alive. I stepped off the floor, leaving the ledgers where they lay, and the air seemed lighter at first. But that relief didn't last. It was gone the instant I felt it, the eyes. Something invisible, patient, following me between the shadows of the printing factory. I turned sharply, scanning the beams and rafters, the machinery frozen in rusted silence, but there was nothing. Just silence. Yet I could feel it pressing on me, watching my every move. The hallways stretched like a maze, corners folding into darkness. Each step I took echoed, but faintly, like the building itself had absorbed the sound, then spat it back at me in uneven bursts. Footsteps. I wasn't sure if I imagined them or if they were real. They weren't my own. They were lighter, hesitant, careful, and they never stopped. I tried to rationalize. Old floors, loose boards, maybe a rat scurrying in the rafters, but the pattern was too deliberate. Step, pause, step. It matched mine almost as if someone or something was learning my rhythm. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my fingers twitching. The factory didn't just exist, it remembered. And now it remembered me. I passed the stacks of paper towering like silent sentinels. Dust fell from the edges, drifting through the air, illuminated by weak light from cracked windows. Something shifted within the stacks, a shadow stretching where none should be. I froze, staring at the gap, imagining shapes where there might be none. But my skin prickled. The space felt occupied. A smell hit me, faint, metallic, like old blood mixed with ink. My stomach twisted. Memories of the ledgers flooded back. Donovan's notes, the missing workers, the threats left unsent. It wasn't just paper that remembered. It was the factory. Every corner, every beam, every stack of documents carried the echo of what had happened here. I moved cautiously, hugging the walls, trying to keep sightlines open. The footsteps followed, unrelenting. I turned a corner and caught sight of a desk tucked against the wall, papers strewn as if someone had fled in a hurry. A chair lay on its side. The scene froze me. It was identical to the sketches I had seen in Donovan's ledger. A tableau of panic captured decades ago, replaying for me alone. The footsteps shifted slightly, coming from above or maybe behind the stacks. I couldn't tell. My throat was tight. I whispered to myself, trying to convince my own mind, trying to anchor myself in reason. It's just the building, just the building. But even as I said it, the words sounded hollow. I wasn't convincing myself. I stepped closer to the desk and something moved again. A subtle displacement of air, a shadow brushing against the papers. My fingers trembled as I lifted one sheet. It was a note unsigned. The handwriting jagged, hurried. He watches, he waits. My breath caught. Not someone, not they, just he, Donovan, or something else that had claimed him. The footsteps became more deliberate. Step, pause, step. Closer now, echoing faintly through the hollow floors. I could feel the rhythm against my own heartbeat. I glanced behind the stacks, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw a figure, dark, tall, unmoving. But the shape dissolved the instant I focused. I tried to keep moving, but the factory was alive. The stacks seemed to close in, narrow corridors forming where there had been open space. Dust motes swirled, casting shapes like dancing figures in my peripheral vision. I blinked and the shapes stretched, elongated. It wasn't my eyes playing tricks. The building itself was shaping the world around me, a slow, deliberate memory of fear made physical. I found another desk, smaller, almost hidden in a corner. Papers scattered across it told a fragmented story, accounts, notes, personal belongings left behind. A half-burned photograph showed three men smiling, unaware of the fate that awaited them. One of them had eyes that seemed to follow me, even in monochrome. I shivered. The factory had preserved more than ledgers. It had preserved essence, echo, life frozen mid-motion. A sudden creak overhead made me flinch. The footsteps, no longer mimicking mine, moved with intention, now closer, more confident. I spun, heart hammering. Nothing. Only stacks of paper and shadows. But I knew I wasn't alone. I never had been alone here. Every corner, every empty space, every silent object remembered Donovan's panic, the missing workers, the deals, the betrayals. I moved deeper into the stacks. Light flickered from broken fixtures, casting long, distorted shadows. One beam caught the edge of a ledger lying open atop a crate. I approached. The pages were blank, but faint impressions could be seen, words pressed into the paper, invisible to the casual eye. I could read them. Desperate confessions, hurried calculations, warnings to no one. The impressions were ghostly but undeniable. The factory didn't just remember, it recorded. Footsteps shifted again, slightly to my right. I froze. The sound was too precise, deliberate. I could feel it in my chest. Whoever or whatever was following me knew every movement I made. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. The shadow moved, always just out of reach, just in the corner of vision. Always patient, always waiting. I found a narrow corridor between two stacks. The walls were lined with old ledgers, personal items, remnants of lives once lived. Shoes, gloves, a broken watch. Each object seemed to hum with the memory of its owner, a slow vibration I could feel through the soles of my feet. I realized I was walking through history, the fear, the panic, the quiet violence, all suspended in air and paper. A sudden flicker of movement caught my eye, a hand, pale, reaching from behind a stack. I jerked back. The hand vanished instantly. I told myself it was a trick of the shadows, an overactive imagination fueled by stress and dust. But the factory's breath was in my ears now, cold, sharp, insistent. I pressed on, the whispers of the past growing louder though still imperceptible. Words formed in my mind, fragments of conversations. He knows. You should. Gone before they see. I couldn't tell if these were memories of people or of the factory itself speaking, teaching me to understand. At the far end of the corridor, a desk sat beneath a broken skylight. Sunlight slivered in, illuminating the surface. Papers, yellowed and brittle, were arranged in careful chaos. I approached. One paper bore a single name repeated, Donovan. Another listed dates of disappearances, corresponding with ledger entries I had seen. But one date was new, later than anything I had found before. Someone, or something, continued the record after he vanished. I felt it then. Movement behind me, faint but undeniable. Step, pause, step. I whirled, but nothing. The air was thick now, almost tactile, as if the factory itself had mass. Shadows pooled around my feet, stretching like black water. I realized I was trapped in the memory, the fear, the record. And the observer, whatever followed, was patient, waiting for me to understand or to make a mistake. I picked up a photograph from the desk. It was old, faded, showing Donovan at the office, but something was off. Behind him, the shadows didn't match the room. They curved unnaturally, forming a shape I couldn't name. A presence. Watching. I set it down slowly. The footsteps moved again, closer, echoing softly, taunting. I backed away, heart in my throat. The factory seemed to shift, corridors narrowing, shadows pooling. I understood then. The building didn't just remember crimes, it enforced them. Every footprint, every desk, every paper whispered of greed, panic, and betrayal. And it was still alive with those echoes, following, waiting. I reached the main aisle, the path to the exit. The light from broken windows barely illuminated the way, but I didn't feel relief. The shadows in the stacks stretched toward me, elongated, almost human. Step, pause, step. I dared not look back, not yet, not until I understood. As I reached the door, I felt it, a sudden shift in the air, a pulse of presence like the factory exhaling. And for the first time, I felt the weight of the missing, the ledgered confessions, the unseen observer, all pressing in at once. The building had remembered me fully now, and it wouldn't forget. I pushed the door open and stumbled into the dim hallway beyond. The footsteps ceased. Silence returned, but it was different, thicker, expectant. I realized the factory had allowed me out, but it had left something behind. A question, a warning, a fragment of memory that clung to me, impossible to shake. I left the floor, but I knew I had not left it behind. The shadows in the stacks remained, patient, waiting. And the paper trail of greed and fear of Donovan and those lost had followed me, settling deep in my mind. I understood that the factory's memory was patient. It watched, it waited, and one day it would demand more than observation.